Section 1 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G. B. Ives. Section 1. Introduction. The contents of these volumes of celebrated crimes, as well as the motives which led to their inception, are unique. They are a series of stories based upon historical records, from the pen of Alexandre Dumas, père, when he was not the elder, nor yet the author of D'Artagnan or Monte Cristo, but was a rising young dramatist, and a lion in the literary set and world of fashion. Dumas, in fact, wrote his Crimes célèbres just prior to launching upon his wonderful series of historical novels, and they may therefore be considered as source books, whence he was to draw so much of that far-reaching and intimate knowledge of inner history which has perennially astonished his readers. The Crimes were published in Paris in 1839–40 in 8 volumes comprising 18 titles, all of which now appear in the present carefully translated text. The success of the original work was instantaneous. Dumas laughingly said that he thought he had exhausted the subject of famous crimes, until the work was off the press, when he immediately became deluged with letters from every province in France, supplying him with material upon other deeds of violence. The subjects which he had chosen, however, are of both historic and dramatic importance, and they have the added value of giving the modern reader a clear picture of the state of semi-lawlessness which existed in Europe during the Middle Ages. The Borgias, the Cenci, Urban Grandier, the Marchioness of Brinvilliers, the Marchioness of Ganges, and the rest, what subjects for the pen of Dumas! Exclaims Garnet. Space does not permit us to consider in detail the material here collected, although each title will be found to present points of special interest. The first volume comprises the annals of the Borgias and the Cenci. The name of the noted and notorious Florentine family has become a synonym for intrigue and violence, and yet the Borgias have not been without staunch defenders in history. Another famous Italian story is that of the Cenci. The beautiful Beatrice Cenci, celebrated in the painting of Guido, the 16th-century romance of Guerrazzi, and the poetic tragedy of Shelley, not to mention numerous succeeding works inspired by her hapless fate, will always remain a shadowy figure and one of infinite pathos. The second volume chronicles the sanguinary deeds in the south of France, carried on in the name of religion, but drenching in blood the fair country round about Avignon for a long period of years. The third volume is devoted to the story of Mary Queen of Scots, another woman who suffered a violent death, and around whose name an endless controversy has waged. Dumas goes carefully into the dubious episodes of her stormy career, but does not allow these to blind his sympathy for her fate. Mary, it should be remembered, was closely allied to France by education and marriage, and the French never forgave Elizabeth the part she played in the tragedy. The fourth volume comprises 3 widely dissimilar tales. One of the strangest stories is that of Urbain Grandier, the innocent victim of a cunning and relentless religious plot. His story was dramatized by Dumas in 1850. A famous German crime is that of Karl Ludwig Sand, whose murder of Kotzebue, councillor of the Russian legation, caused an international upheaval which was not to subside for many years. An especially interesting volume is number 6, containing, among other material, the famous Man in the Iron Mask. This unsolved puzzle of history was later incorporated by Dumas in one of the D'Artagnan romances, a collection of the Vicomte de Bragelonne, to which it gave its name. But in this later form the true story of this singular man, doomed to wear an iron visor over his features during his entire lifetime, could only be treated episodically. While as a special subject in the Crimes, Dumas indulges his curiosity and that of his reader to the full. Hugo's unfinished tragedy, Les Jumeaux, is on the same subject. as also are others by Fournier in French and Zschokke in German. Other stories can be given only passing mention. The beautiful poisoner, Marquise de Brinvilliers, must have suggested to Dumas his later portrait of Milady in The Three Musketeers, the most celebrated of his woman characters. The incredible cruelties of Ali Pasha, the Turkish despot, should not be charged entirely to Dumas, as he is said to have been largely aided in this by one of his ghosts, Malfil. Not a mere artist, writes Monsieur de Villemessant, founder of the Figaro, he has nevertheless been able to seize on those dramatic effects which have so much distinguished his theatrical career, and to give those sharp and distinct reproductions of character which alone can present to the reader the mind and spirit of an age. Not a mere historian, he has nevertheless carefully consulted the original sources of information, has weighed testimonies, elicited theories, and has interpolated the poetry of history with its most thorough prose. End of section 1.
Section 2 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 2. The Borgias. Prologue. On the 8th of April, 1492, in a bedroom of the Carnegie Palace, about 3 miles from Florence, were 3 men grouped about a bed whereon a fourth lay dying. The first of these 3 men, sitting at the foot of the bed, and half hidden, that he might conceal his tears, in the gold brocaded curtains, was Emilio Barbaro, author of the treatise on celibacy, and of Studies in Pliny. The year before, when he was at Rome in the capacity of ambassador of the Florentine Republic, he had been appointed Patriarch of Aquileia by Innocent VIII. The second, who was kneeling and holding one hand of the dying man between his own, was Angelo Poliziano, the Catullus of the 15th century, a classic of the lighter sort, who in his Latin verses might have been mistaken for a poet of the Augustan age. The third, who was standing up and leaning against one of the twisted columns of the bedhead, following with profound sadness the progress of the malady which he read in the face of his departing friend, was the famous Pico della Mirandola, who at the age of 20 could speak 22 languages, and who had offered to reply in each of these languages to any 700 questions that might be put to him by the 20 most learned men in the whole world, if they could be assembled at Florence. The man on the bed was Lorenzo the Magnificent, who at the beginning of the year had been attacked by a severe and deep-seated fever, to which was added the gout, a hereditary ailment in his family. He had found at last that the draughts containing dissolved pearls which the quack doctor, Leone di Spolito, prescribed for him, as if he desired to adapt his remedies rather to the riches of his patient than to his necessities, were useless and unavailing, and so he had come to understand that he must part from those gentle-tongued women of his, those sweet-voiced poets, his palaces and their rich hangings. Therefore he had summoned to give him absolution for his sins, in a man of less high place they might perhaps have been called crimes, the Dominican Girolamo Francesco Savonarola. It was not, however, without an inward fear, against which the praises of his friends availed nothing, that the pleasure-seeker and usurper awaited that severe and gloomy preacher by whose words all Florence was stirred, and on whose pardon henceforth depended all his hope for another world. Indeed, Savonarola was one of those men of stone, coming, like the statue of the Commandante, to knock at the door of a Don Giovanni, and in the midst of feast and orgy, to announce that it is even now the moment to begin to think of heaven. He had been born at Ferrara, whither his family, one of the most illustrious of Padua, had been called by Nicola, Marchese d'Este, and at the age of 23, summoned by an irresistible vocation, had fled from his father's house, and had taken the vows in the cloister of Dominican monks at Florence. There, where he was appointed by his superiors to give lessons in philosophy, The young novice had from the first to battle against the defects of a voice that was both harsh and weak, a defective pronunciation, and above all, the depression of his physical powers, exhausted as they were by too severe abstinence. Savonarola from that time condemned himself to the most absolute seclusion, and disappeared in the depths of his convent, as if the slab of his tomb had already fallen over him. There, kneeling on the flags, praying unceasingly before a wooden crucifix, fevered by vigils and penances, he soon passed out of contemplation into ecstasy, and began to feel in himself that inward prophetic impulse which summoned him to preach the reformation of the Church. Nevertheless, the Reformation of Savonarola, more reverential than Luther's, which followed about 25 years later, respected the thing while attacking the man, and had as its aim the altering of teaching that was human, not faith that was of God. He did not work, like the German monk, by reasoning, but by enthusiasm. With him logic always gave way before inspiration. He was not a theologian, but a prophet. Yet although hitherto he had bowed his head before the authority of the Church, he had already raised it against the temporal power. To him religion and liberty appeared as two virgins equally sacred, so that in his view Lorenzo in subjugating the one was as culpable as Pope Innocent VIII in dishonoring the other. The result of this was that, so long as Lorenzo lived in riches, happiness, and magnificence, Savonarola had never been willing, whatever entreaties were made, to sanction by his presence a power which he considered illegitimate. But Lorenzo on his deathbed sent for him, and that was another matter. The austere preacher set forth at once, bareheaded and barefoot, hoping to save not only the soul of the dying man, but also the liberty of the Republic. Lorenzo, as we have said, was awaiting the arrival of Savonarola with an impatience mixed with uneasiness, so that when he heard the sound of his steps, his pale face took a yet more death-like tinge, while at the same time he raised himself on his elbow and ordered his three friends to go away. They obeyed at once, and scarcely had they left by one door than the curtain of the other was raised, and the monk, pale, immovable, solemn, appeared on the threshold. When he perceived him, Lorenzo de' Medici, reading in his marble brow the inflexibility of a statue, fell back on his bed, breathing a sigh so profound that one might have supposed it was his last. The monk glanced around the room as though to assure himself that he was really alone with the dying man. Then he advanced with a slow and solemn step towards the bed. Lorenzo watched his approach with terror. Then, when he was close beside him, he cried, "O my father, I have been a very great sinner." "The mercy of God is infinite," replied the monk, "and I have come into your presence laden with a divine mercy." "You believe, then, that God will forgive my sins?" cried the dying man, renewing his hope as he heard from the lips of the monk such unexpected words. "Your sins and also your crimes, God will forgive them all," replied Savonarola. "God will forgive your vanities, your adulterous pleasures, your obscene festivals. So much for your sins. God will forgive you for promising 2,000 florins reward to the man who should bring you the head of Dieta Salvi, Nerone Nigi, Angelo Antorinori, Nicolo Soderini, and twice the money if they were handed over alive. God will forgive you for dooming to the scaffold or the gibbet the son of Papi Orlandi, Francesco de Brisagila, Bernardo Nardi, Jacopo Frescobaldi, Amaretto Baldovinetti, Petro Balducci, Bernardo di Bondin, Francesco Frescobaldi, and more than 300 others whose names were none the less dear to Florence because they were less renowned. So much for your crimes." And at each of these names, which Savonarola pronounced slowly, his eyes fixed on the dying man, he replied with a groan which proved the monk's memory to be only too true. Then at last, when he had finished, Lorenzo asked in a doubtful tone, "Then do you believe, my father, that God will forgive me everything, both my sins and my crimes?" "Everything," said Savonarola, "but on 3 conditions." "What are they?" asked the dying man. "The first," said Savonarola, "is that you feel a complete faith in the power and the mercy of God." "My father," replied Lorenzo eagerly, "I feel this faith in the very depths of my heart." "The second," said Savonarola, "is that you give back the property of others which you have unjustly confiscated and kept." "My father, shall I have time?" asked the dying man. "God will give it to you," replied the monk. Lorenzo shut his eyes, as though to reflect more at his ease. Then, after a moment's silence, he replied, "Yes, my father, I will do it." "The third," resumed Savonarola, "is that you restore to the Republic her ancient independence and her former liberty." Lorenzo sat up on his bed, shaken by a convulsive movement, and questioned with his eyes the eyes of the Dominican, as though he would find out if he had deceived himself and not heard aright. Savonarola repeated the same words. "Never, never!" exclaimed Lorenzo, falling back on his bed and shaking his head. "Never!" The monk, without replying a single word, made a step to withdraw. my father," said the dying man, "do not leave me thus. Have pity on me." "Have pity on Florence," said the monk. "But my father," cried Lorenzo, "Florence is free, Florence is happy." "Florence is a slave, Florence is poor," cried Savonarola. "Poor in genius, poor in money, and poor in courage. Poor in genius because after you, Lorenzo, will come your son Piero. Poor in money because from the funds of the Republic you have kept up the magnificence of your family and the credit of your business houses. Poor in courage because you have robbed the rightful magistrates of the authority which was constitutionally theirs, and diverted the citizens from the double path of military and civil life, wherein before they were enervated by your luxuries they had displayed the virtues of the ancients. And therefore, when the day shall dawn which is not far distant," continued the monk, his eyes fixed and glowing as if he were reading the future, "whereon the barbarians shall descend from the mountains, the walls of our towns, like those of Jericho, shall fall at the blast of their trumpets." "And do you desire that I should yield up on my deathbed the power that has made the glory of my whole life?" cried Lorenzo de' Medici. "It is not I who desire it, it is the Lord," replied Savonarola coldly. "Impossible, impossible," murmured Lorenzo. "Very well, then die as you have lived," cried the monk, "in the midst of your courtiers and flatterers. Let them ruin your soul as they have ruined your body." And at these words the austere Dominican, without listening to the cries of the dying man, left the room as he had entered it, with face and step unaltered. Far above human things he seemed to soar, a spirit already detached from the earth. At the cry which broke from Lorenzo de' Medici when he saw him disappear, Ermolio, Poliziano, and Pico delta Morandola, who had heard all, returned into the room, and found their friend convulsively clutching in his arms a magnificent crucifix which he had just taken down from the bedhead. In vain did they try to reassure him with friendly words. Lorenzo the Magnificent only replied with sobs. And 1 hour after the scene which they had just related, his lips clinging to the feet of the Christ, he breathed his last in the arms of these 3 men, of whom the most fortunate, though all 3 were young, was not destined to survive him more than 2 years. Since his death was to bring about many calamities, says Niccolo Machiavelli, it was the will of heaven to show this by omens only too certain. The dome of the church of Santa Regerata was struck by lightning, and Roderigo Borgia was elected pope. End of section 2.
Section 3 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas, translated by G.B. Ives. Section 3, The Borgias, Chapter 1. Towards the end of the 15th century, that is to say, at the epoch when our history opens, the Piazza of St. Peter's at Rome was far from presenting so noble an aspect as that which is offered in our own day to anyone who approaches it by the Piazza dei Rusticucci. In fact, the Basilica of Constantine existed no longer, while that of Michelangelo, the masterpiece of 30 popes, which cost the labor of 3 centuries and the expense of 260 millions, existed not yet. The ancient edifice, which had lasted for 1145 years, had been threatening to fall in about 1440, and Nicholas V, artistic forerunner of Julius II and Leo V, had had it pulled down, together with the temple of Probus Anicius, which had adjoined it. In their place he had had the foundations of a new temple laid by the architects Rosellini and Battista Alberti, but some years later, after the death of Nicholas V, the Venetian had not been able to give more than 5,000 crowns to continue the project of his predecessor. and thus the building was arrested when it had scarcely risen above the ground, and presented the appearance of a stillborn edifice, even sadder than that of a ruin. As to the piazza itself, it had not yet, as the reader will understand from the foregoing explanation, either the fine colonnade of Bernini, or the dancing fountains, or the Egyptian obelisk which, according to Pliny, was set up by the Pharaoh of Heliopolis, and transferred to Rome by Caligula, who set it up in Nero's circus, where it remained till 1586. Now, as Nero's circus was situate on the very ground where St. Peter's now stands, and the base of this obelisk covered the actual site where the vestry now is, it looked like a gigantic needle shooting up from the middle of truncated volumes, walls of unequal height, and half-carved stones. On the right of this building, a ruin from its cradle, arose the Vatican, a splendid Tower of Babel, to which all the celebrated architects of the Roman school contributed their works for 1,000 years. At this epoch the 2 magnificent chapels did not exist, nor the 12 great halls, the 22 courts, the 30 staircases, and the 2,000 bedchambers. For Pope Sixtus V, the sublime swineherd, who did so many things in his 5 years' reign, had not yet been able to add the immense building which on the eastern side towers above the court of St. Damasius. Still, it was truly the old sacred edifice, with its venerable associations, in which Charlemagne received hospitality when he was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III. All the same, on the 9th of August, 1492, the whole of Rome, from the People's Gate to the Colosseum, and from the Baths of Diocletian to the Castle of St. Angelo, seemed to have made an appointment on this piazza. The multitude thronging to it was so great as to overflow into all the neighboring streets, which started from this center like the rays of a star. The crowds of people, looking like a motley moving carpet, were climbing up into the basilica, grouping themselves upon the stones, hanging on the columns, standing up against the walls. They entered by the doors of houses and reappeared at the windows, so numerous and so densely packed that one might have said each window was walled up with heads. Now all this multitude had its eyes fixed on one single point in the Vatican, for in the Vatican was the conclave, and as Innocent VIII had been dead for 6 days, the conclave was in the act of electing a pope. Rome is the town of elections, since her foundation down to our own day. That is to say, in the course of nearly 26 centuries, she has constantly elected her kings, consuls, tribunes, emperors, and popes. Thus Rome during the days of conclave appears to be attacked by a strange fever which drives everyone to the Vatican or to Montecavallo, according as the scarlet-robed assembly is held in one or the other of these 2 places. It is, in fact, because the raising up of a new pontiff is a great event for everyone. For according to the average established in the period between St. Peter and Gregory XVI, every pope lasts about 8 years, and these 8 years, according to the character of the man who is elected, are a period either of tranquillity or of disorder, of justice or of venality, of peace or of war. Never, perhaps, since the day when the first successor of St. Peter took his seat on the pontifical throne, until the interregnum which now occurred, had so great an agitation been shown as there was at this moment, when, as we have shown, all these people were thronging on the piazza of St. Peter, and in the street which led to it. It is true that this was not without reason, for Innocent VIII, who was called the father of his people because he had added to his subjects 8 sons and the same number of daughters, had, as we have said, after living a life of self-indulgence, just died, after a death struggle during which, if the journal of Stefano in Fessura may be believed, 220 murders were committed in the streets of Rome. The authority had then devolved in the customary way upon the Cardinal Camerlengo, who during the interregnum had sovereign powers, but as he had been obliged to fulfill all the duties of his office, that is, to get money coined in his name and bearing his arms, to take the fisherman's ring from the finger of the dead Pope, to dress, shave, and paint him, to have the corpse embalmed, to lower the coffin after 9 days' obsequies into the provisional niche, where the last deceased Pope has to remain until his successor comes to take his place and consign him to his final tomb. Lastly, as he had been obliged to wall up the door of the conclave and the window of the balcony from which the pontifical election is proclaimed, he had not had a single moment for busying himself with the police, so that the assassinations had continued in goodly fashion, and there were loud cries for an energetic hand which should make all these swords and all these daggers retire into their sheaths. Now the eyes of this multitude were fixed, as we have said, upon the Vatican, and particularly upon one chimney, from which would come the first signal, when suddenly, at the moment of the Ave Maria, that is to say, at the hour when the day begins to decline, great cries went up from all the crowd mixed with bursts of laughter, a discordant murmur of threats and raillery, the cause being that they had just perceived at the top of the chimney a thin smoke, which seemed like a light cloud to go up perpendicularly into the sky. This smoke announced that Rome was still without a master, and that the world still had no Pope, for this was the smoke of the voting tickets which were being burned, a proof that the cardinals had not yet come to an agreement. Scarcely had this smoke appeared, to vanish almost immediately, when all the innumerable crowd, knowing well that there was nothing else to wait for, and that all was said and done until 10 o'clock the next morning, the time when the cardinals had their first voting, went off in a tumult of noisy joking, just as they would after the last rocket of a fireworks display, so that at the end of 1 minute nobody was there when a quarter of an hour before there had been an excited crowd, except a few curious laggards who, living in the neighborhood or on the very piazza itself, were less in a hurry than the rest to get back to their homes. Again, little by little, these last groups insensibly diminished. For 9:30 had just struck, and at this hour the streets of Rome began already to be far from safe. Then after these groups followed some solitary passer-by, hurrying his steps, one after another the doors were closed, one after another the windows were darkened. At last, when 10 o'clock struck, with the single exception of one window in the Vatican, where a lamp might be seen, keeping obstinate vigil, all the houses, piazzas, and streets were plunged in the deepest obscurity. At this moment a man, wrapped in a cloak, stood up like a ghost against one of the columns of the uncompleted basilica, and gliding slowly and carefully among the stones which were lying about round the foundations of the new church, advanced as far as the fountain, which formed the centre of the piazza, erected in the very place where the obelisk is now set up, of which we have spoken already. When he reached this spot he stopped, doubly concealed by the darkness of the night and by the shade of the monument, and after looking around him to see if he were really alone, drew his sword, and with its point rapping 3 times on the pavement of the piazza, each time made the sparks fly. This signal, for signal it was not lost. The last lamp which still kept vigil in the Vatican went out, and at the same instant an object thrown out of the window fell a few paces off from the young man in the cloak. He, guided by the silvery sound it had made in touching the flags, lost no time in laying his hand upon it in spite of the darkness, and when he had it in his possession, hurried quickly away. Thus the unknown walked without turning round halfway along the Borgo Vecchio, but there he turned round to the right, and took a street at the other end of which was set up a Madonna with a lamp. He approached the light, and drew from his pocket the object he had picked up, which was nothing else than a Roman crown piece. But this crown unscrewed, and in a cavity hollow in its thickness enclosed a letter, which the man to whom it was addressed began to read at the risk of being recognized, so great was his haste to know what it contained. We say at the risk of being recognized, for in his eagerness the recipient of this nocturnal missive had thrown back the hood of his cloak, and as his head was wholly within the luminous circle cast by the lamp, it was easy to distinguish in the light the head of a handsome young man about 25 or 26, dressed in a purple doublet slashing at the shoulder and elbow to let the shirt come through, and wearing on his head a cap of the same color, with a long black feather falling to his shoulder. It is true that he did not stand there long, for scarcely had he finished the letter, or rather the note, which he had just received in so strange and mysterious a manner, when he replaced it in its silver receptacle, and readjusting his cloak so as to hide all the lower part of his face, resumed his walk with a rapid step, crossed Borgo San Spirito, and took the street of the Longara, which he followed as far as the church of Regina Coeli. When he arrived at this place he gave 3 rapid knocks on the door of a house of good appearance, which immediately opened. Then, slowly mounting the stairs, he entered a room where 2 women were awaiting him with an impatience so unconcealed that both, as they saw him, exclaimed together, "Well, Francesco, what news?" "Good news, my mother, good, my sister," replied the young man, kissing one and giving his hand to the other. "Our father has gained 3 votes today, but he still needs 6 to have the majority." "Then is there no means of buying them?" cried the elder of the 2 women, while the younger, instead of speaking, asked him with a look. "Certainly, my mother, certainly," replied the young man, "and it is just about that my father has been thinking. He is giving Cardinal Orsini his place at Rome, and his 2 castles of Monticello and Soriano to Cardinal Colonna. His abbey of Subiaco he gives to Cardinal Sant'Angelo, the Bishop of Porto, with the furniture and cellar to the Cardinal of Parma, the town of Nepi, to the Cardinal of Genoa, the church of Santa Maria in Violata, and last to Cardinal Savelli, the church of Santa Maria Maggiore and the town of Civita Castellana. As to the Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, he knows already that the day before yesterday we sent to his house 4 mules laden with silver and plate, and out of this treasure he has engaged to give 5,000 ducats to the Cardinal Patriarch of Venice." "But how shall we get the others to know the intentions of Roderigo?" asked the elder of the 2 women. "My father has provided for everything, and proposes an easy method. You know, my mother, with what sort of ceremonial the Cardinal's dinner is carried in." "Yes, on a litter, in a large basket with the arms of the Cardinal for whom the meal is prepared." "My father has bribed the bishop who examines it. Tomorrow is a feast day to the Cardinal Orsini, Colonna, Savelli, Sant'Angelo, and the Cardinals of Parma and Genoa. Chickens will be sent for hot meat, and each chicken will contain a deed of gift duly drawn up, made by me in my father's name, of the houses, palaces, or churches which are destined for each." "Capital!" said the elder of the 2 women. "Now I am certain all will go well." "And by the grace of God," added the younger, with a strangely mocking smile, "our father will be Pope." "Oh, it will be a fine day for us!" cried Francesco. "And for Christendom," replied his sister with still more ironical expression. "Lucrezia, Lucrezia," said the mother, "you do not deserve the happiness which is coming to us." "What does that matter if it comes all the same? Besides, you know the proverb, mother, 'Large families are blessed of the Lord,' and still more so our family which is so patriarchal." At the same time she cast on her brother a look so wanton that the young man blushed under it. But as at the moment he had to think of other things than his illicit loves, he ordered that 4 servants should be awakened, and while they were getting armed to accompany him, he drew up and signed the 6 deeds of gift which were to be carried the next day to the cardinals, for not wishing to be seen at their houses, he thought he would profit by the night time to carry them himself to certain persons in his confidence, who would have them passed in, as had already been arranged, at the dinner hour. Then, when the deeds were quite ready, and the servants also, Francesco went out with them, leaving the 2 women to dream golden dreams of their future greatness. From the first dawn of the day the people hurried anew, as ardent and interested as on the evening before, to the piazza of the Vatican, where, at the ordinary time, that is, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the smoke rose again as usual, evoking laughter and murmuring as it announced that none of the cardinals had secured the majority. A report, however, began to be spread about that the chances were divided between three candidates, who were Rodrigo Borgia, Giuliano delta Ravera, and Ascanio Sforza, for the people as yet knew nothing of 4 mules laden with plate silver, which had been led to Sforza's house, by reason of which he had given up his own votes to his rival. In the midst of the agitation excited in the crowd by this new report, a solemn chanting was heard. It proceeded from a procession led by a Cardinal Camerlengo, with the object of obtaining from heaven the speedy election of a pope. This procession, starting from the church of Aracoeli at the capital, was to make stations before the principal Madonnas and the most frequented churches. As soon as the silver crucifix was perceived which went in front, the most profound silence prevailed, and everyone fell on his knees. Thus a supreme calm followed the tumult and uproar which had been heard a few minutes before, and which at each appearance of the smoke had assumed a more threatening character. There was a shrewd suspicion that the procession, as well as having a religious end in view, had a political object also, and that its influence was intended to be as great on earth as in heaven. In any case, if such had been the design of the Cardinal Camerlengo, he had not deceived himself, and the effect was what he desired. When the procession had gone past, the laughing and joking continued, but the cries and threats had completely ceased. The whole day passed thus, for in Rome nobody works. You're either a cardinal or a lackey, and you live nobody knows how. The crowd was still extremely numerous, when towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, another procession, which had quite as much power of provoking noise as the first of imposing silence, traversed in its turn to the piazza of St. Peter's. This was the dinner procession. The people received it with the usual bursts of laughter, without suspecting, for all their irreverence, that this procession, more efficacious than the former, had just settled the election of the new pope. The hour of the Ave Maria came as on the evening before, but, as on the evening before, the waiting of the whole day was lost, for as 8:30 struck, the daily smoke reappeared at the top of the chimney. But when at the same moment rumors which came from the inside of the Vatican were spread about, announcing that in all probability the election would take place the next day, the good people preserved their patience. Besides, it had been very hot that day, and they were so broken with fatigue and roasted by the sun, these dwellers in shade and idleness, that they had no strength left to complain. The morning of the next day, which was the 11th of August, 1492, arose stormy and dark. This did not hinder the multitude from thronging the piazzas, streets, doors, houses, churches. Moreover, this disposition of the weather was a real blessing from heaven, for if there were heat, at least there would be no sun. Towards 9 o'clock threatening storm clouds were heaped over all the Trastevere, but to this crowd what mattered rain, lightning, or thunder? They were preoccupied with the concern of a very different nature. They were waiting for their pope. A promise had been made them for today, and it could be seen by the manner of all that if the day should pass without any election taking place, the end of it might very well be a riot. Therefore, in proportion as the time advanced, the agitation grew greater. 9 o'clock, 9:30, 9:45 struck, without anything happening to confirm or destroy their hopes. At last the first stroke of 10 was heard. All eyes turned toward the chimney. 10 o'clock struck slowly, each stroke vibrating in the heart of the multitude. At last the 10th stroke trembled, then vanished shuddering into space, and a great cry breaking simultaneously from 100,000 breasts followed the silence. Non ve fumo! There is no smoke. In other words, we have a pope. At this moment the rain began to fall, but no one paid any attention to it, so great were the transports of joy and impatience among all the people. At last a little stone was detached from the walled window, which gave on the balcony and upon which all eyes were fixed. A general shout saluted its fall. Little by little the aperture grew larger, and in a few minutes it was large enough to allow a man to come out on the balcony. The Cardinal Ascanio Sforza appeared, but at the moment when he was on the point of coming out, frightened by the rain and the lightning, he hesitated an instant and finally drew back. Immediately the multitude in their turn broke out like a tempest into cries, curses, howls, threatening to tear down the Vatican and to go seek their Pope themselves. At this noise Cardinal Sforza, more terrified by the popular storm than by the storm in the heavens, advanced on the balcony, and between two thunderclaps, in a moment of silence astonishing to anyone who had just heard the clamor that went before, made the following proclamation: I announce to you a great joy. The most eminent and most revered Signor Rodrigo Lenzolo Borgia, Archbishop of Valencia, Cardinal Dico of San Nicolo in Carcere, Vice Chancellor of the Church, has now been elected Pope, and has assumed the name of Alexander VI. The news of this nomination was received with strange joy. Rodrigo Borgia had the reputation of a dissolute man, it is true, but libertinism had mounted the throne with Sixtus IV. And Innocent VIII, so that for the Romans there was nothing new in the singular situation of a pope with a mistress and 5 children. The great thing for the moment was that the power fell into strong hands, and it was more important for the tranquillity of Rome that the new pope inherited the sword of St. Paul than that he inherited the keys of St. Peter. And so, in the feasts that were given on this occasion, the dominant character was much more warlike than religious, and would have appeared rather to suit with the election of some young conqueror than the exaltation of an old pontiff. There was no limit to the pleasantries and prophetic epigrams of the name of Alexander, which for the second time seemed to promise the Romans the empire of the world, and the same evening, in the midst of brilliant illuminations and bonfires, which seemed to turn the town into a lake of flame, the following epigram was read, amid the acclamation of the people: Rome under Caesar's rule is ancient history, at home and o'er the world victorious trod, but Alexander still extends his glory. Caesar was man, but Alexander God. As to the new pope, scarcely had he completed the formalities of etiquette which his exaltation imposed upon him, and paid to each man the price of his simony, when from the height of the Vatican he cast his eyes upon Europe, a vast political game of chess, which he cherished the hope of directing at the will of his own genius. End of the Borgias, Chapter 1.
Section 4 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 4, The Borgias, Chapter 2. The world had now arrived at one of those supreme moments of history when everything is transformed between the end of one period and the beginning of another. In the east, Turkey; in the south, Spain; in the west, France; and in the north, Germany, all were going to assume, together with the title of great powers, that influence which they were destined to exert in the future over the secondary states. Accordingly, we too, with Alexander VI, will cast a rapid glance over them, and see what were their respective situations in regard to Italy, which they all coveted as a prize. Constantine, Palaeologos, besieged by 300,000 Turks, after having appealed in vain for aid to the whole of Christendom, had not been willing to survive the loss of his empire, and had been found in the midst of the dead, close to the Tophana gate. And on the 30th of May, 1453, Mohammed II had made his entry into Constantinople, where, after a reign which had earned for him the surname of Fatil, or the Conqueror, he had died, leaving 2 sons, the elder of whom had ascended the throne under the name of Bajazet II. The accession of the new Sultan, however, had not taken place with the tranquillity which his right as elder brother and his father's choice of him should have promised. His younger brother, Djem, better known under the name of Zizima, had argued that whereas he was born in the purple, that is, born during the reign of Mohammed, Bajazet was born prior to his epoch, and was therefore the son of a private individual. This was rather a poor trick, but where force is all and right is naught, it was good enough to stir up a war. The 2 brothers, each at the head of an army, met accordingly in Asia in 1482. Djem was defeated after a 7 hours' fight, and pursued by his brother, who gave him no time to rally his army. He was obliged to embark from Cilicia, and took refuge in Rhodes, where he implored the protection of the Knights of St. John. They, not daring to give him an asylum in their island so near to Asia, sent him to France, where they had him carefully guarded in one of their commanderies, in spite of the urging of Qaid Bey, Sultan of Egypt, who, having revolted against Bajazet, desired to have the young prince in his army to give his rebellion the appearance of legitimate warfare. The same demand, moreover, with the same political object, had been made successively by Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, by Ferdinand, King of Aragon and Sicily, and by Ferdinand, King of Naples. On his side, Bajazet, who knew all the importance of such a rival if he once allied himself with any one of the princes with whom he was at war, had sent ambassadors to Charles VIII, offering, if he would consent to keep Djem with him, to give him a considerable pension, and to give to France the sovereignty of the Holy Land so soon as Jerusalem should be conquered by the Sultan of Egypt. The King of France had accepted these terms. But then Innocent VIII had intervened, and in his turn had claimed Djem ostensibly to give support to the claims of the refugee to a crusade which he was preaching against the Turks, but in reality to appropriate the pension of 40,000 ducats to be given by Bajazet to any one of the Christian princes who would undertake to be his brother's jailer. Charles VIII had not dared to refuse to the spiritual head of Christendom a request supported by such holy reasons, and therefore Djem had quitted France, accompanied by the Grand Master d'Aubusson, under whose direct charge he was, but his guardian had consented, for the sake of a cardinal's hat, to yield up his prisoner. Thus, on the 13th of March, 1489, the unhappy young man, cynosure of so many interested eyes, made his solemn entry into Rome, mounted on a superb horse, clothed in a magnificent oriental costume, between the Prior of Auvergne, nephew of the Grand Master d'Aubusson, and Francesco Cibo, the son of the Pope. After this he had remained there, and Bajazet, faithful to promises which it was so much his interest to fulfill, had punctually paid to the Sovereign Pontiff a pension of 40,000 ducats. So much for Turkey. Ferdinand and Isabella were reigning in Spain, and were laying the foundations of that vast power which was destined 25 years later to make Charles V declare that the sun never set on his dominions. In fact, these 2 sovereigns, on whom history has bestowed the name of Catholic, had reconquered in succession nearly all Spain, and driven the Moors out of Granada, their last entrenchment. while two men of genius, Bartolome Diaz and Christopher Columbus, had succeeded, much to the profit of Spain, the one in recovering a lost world, the other in conquering a world yet unknown. They had accordingly, thanks to their victories in the ancient world and their discoveries in the new, acquired an influence at the court of Rome which had never been enjoyed by any of their predecessors. So much for Spain. In France, Charles VIII had succeeded his father, Louis XI, on the 30th of August, 1483. Louis, by dint of executions, had tranquilized his kingdom and smoothed the way for a child who ascended the throne under the regency of a woman. And the regency had been a glorious one, and had put down the pretensions of princes of the blood, put an end to civil wars, and united to the crown all that yet remained of the great independent fiefs. The result was that at the epoch where we now are, here was Charles VIII, about 22 years of age, a prince, if we are to believe La Trémouille, little of body but great of heart, a child, if we are to believe Comines, only now making his first flight from the nest, destitute of both sense and money, feeble in person, full of self-will, and consorting rather with fools than with the wise. Lastly, if we are to believe Guicciardini, who as an Italian might well have brought a somewhat partial judgment to bear upon the subject, a young man of little wit concerning the actions of men, but carried away by an ardent desire for rule and the acquisition of glory, a desire based far more on his shallow character and impetuosity than on any consciousness of genius. He was an enemy to all fatigue and all business, and when he tried to give his attention to it, he showed himself always totally wanting in prudence and judgment. If anything in him appeared at first sight to be worthy of praise, on a closer inspection it was found to be something nearer akin to vice than to virtue. He was liberal, it is true, but without thought, with no measure and no discrimination. He was sometimes inflexible in will, but this was through obstinacy rather than a constant mind, and what his flatterers called goodness deserved far more the name of insensibility to injuries or poverty of spirit. As to his physical appearance, if we are to believe the same author, it was still less admirable, and answered marvellously to his weakness of mind and character. He was small, with a large head, a short thick neck, broad chest, and high shoulders. His thighs and legs were long and thin, and as his face also was ugly, and was only redeemed by the dignity and force of his glance, and all his limbs were disproportionate with one another, he had rather the appearance of a monster than a man. Such was he whom fortune was destined to make a conqueror, for whom heaven was reserving more glory than he had power to carry. So much for France. The imperial throne was occupied by Frederick III, who had been rightly named the Peaceful, not for the reason that he had always maintained peace, but because, having constantly been beaten, he had always been forced to make it. The first proof he had given of this very philosophical forbearance was during his journey to Rome, whither he betook himself to be consecrated. In crossing the Apennines he was attacked by brigands. They robbed him, but he made no pursuit, and so, encouraged by example and by the impunity of lesser thieves, the greater ones soon took part in the robberies. Amurath seized part of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus took Lower Austria, and Frederick consoled himself for these usurpations by repeating the maxim, "Forgetfulness is the best cure for the losses we suffer." At the time we have now reached, he had just, after a reign of 53 years, affianced his son Maximilian to Marie of Burgundy, and had put under the ban of the empire his son-in-law, Albert of Bavaria, who laid claim to the ownership of the Tyrol. He was therefore too full of his family affairs to be troubled about Italy. Besides, he was busy looking for a motto for the House of Austria, an occupation of the highest importance for a man of the character of Frederick III. This motto, which Charles V was destined almost to render true, was at last discovered, to the great joy of the old emperor, who, judging that he had nothing more to do on earth after he had given this last proof of sagacity, died on the 19th of August, 1493, leaving the empire to his son Maximilian. This motto was simply founded on the 5 vowels, A-E-I-O-U, the initial letters of these 5 words, Austriae est imperare orbi universo. This means, it is the destiny of Austria to rule over the whole world. So much for Germany. Now that we have cast a glance over the 4 nations which were on the way, as we said before, to become European powers, let us turn our attention to those secondary states which formed a circle more contiguous to Rome, and whose business it was to serve as armor, so to speak, to the spiritual queen of the world, should it please any of these political giants whom we have described to make encroachments with a view to an attack on the seas or the mountains, the Adriatic Gulf or the Alps, the Mediterranean or the Apennines. These were the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, the magnificent Republic of Florence, and the most serene Republic of Venice. The Kingdom of Naples was in the hands of the old Ferdinand, whose birth was not only illegitimate, but probably also well within the prohibited degrees. His father, Alfonso of Aragon, received his crown from Giovanna of Naples, who had adopted him as her successor. But since, in the fear of having no heir, the queen on her deathbed had named 2 instead of 1, Alfonso had to sustain his rights against Renee. The 2 aspirants for some time disputed the crown. At last the House of Aragon carried the day over the House of Anjou, and in the course of the year 1442 Alfonso definitely secured his seat on the throne. Of this sort were the claims of the defeated rival, which we shall see Charles VIII maintaining later on. Ferdinand had neither the courage nor the genius of his father, and yet he triumphed over his enemies one after another. He had 2 rivals, both far superior in merit to himself. The one was his nephew, the Count of Viana, who, basing his claim on his uncle's shameful birth, commanded the whole Aragonese party. The other was Duke John of Calabria, who commanded the whole Angevin party. Still he managed to hold the 2 apart, and to keep himself on the throne by dint of his prudence, which often verged upon duplicity. He had a cultivated mind, and had studied the sciences, above all, law. He was of middle height, with a large handsome head, his brow open and admirably framed in beautiful white hair, which fell nearly down to his shoulders. Moreover, though he had rarely exercised his physical strength in arms, this strength was so great that one day, when he happened to be on the square of the Mercato Nuovo at Naples, he seized by the horns a bull that had escaped, and stopped him short, in spite of all the efforts the animal made to escape from his hands. Now the election of Alexander had caused him great uneasiness, and in spite of his usual prudence, he had not been able to restrain himself from saying before the bearer of the news that not only did he fail to rejoice in this election, but also that he did not think any Christian could rejoice in it, seeing that Borgia, having always been a bad man, would certainly make a bad pope. To this he added that even were the choice an excellent one, and such as would please everybody else, it would be none the less fatal to the House of Aragon, although Rodrigo was born her subject, and owed to her the origin and progress of his fortunes. For wherever reasons of state come in, the ties of blood and parentage are soon forgotten, and a fortiori relations arising from the obligations of nationality. Thus one may see that Ferdinand judged Alexander VI with his usual perspicacity. This, however, did not hinder him, as we shall soon perceive, from being the first to contract an alliance with him. The Duchy of Milan belonged nominally to John Galeazzo, grandson of Francesco Sforza, who had seized it by violence on the 26th of February, 1450, and bequeathed it to his son, Galeazzo Maria, father of the young prince now reigning. We say nominally because the real master of the Milanese was at this period not the legitimate heir who was supposed to possess it, but his uncle Ludovico, surnamed Il Moro, because of the mulberry tree which he bore in his arms. After being exiled with his two brothers, Philip, who died of poison in 1479, and Ascanio, who became the cardinal, he returned to Milan some days after the assassination of Galeazzo Maria, which took place on the 26th of December, 1476, in St. Stephen's Church, and assumed the regency for the young duke, who at that time was only 8 years old. From now onward, even after his nephew had reached the age of 22, Ludovico continued to rule, and according to all probabilities was destined to rule a long time yet. For, some days after the poor young man had shown a desire to take the reins himself, he had fallen sick, and it was said, and not in a whisper, that he had taken one of those slow but mortal poisons of which princes made so frequent a use at this period that, even when a malady was natural, a cause was always sought connected with some great man's interests. However it may have been, Ludovico had relegated his nephew, now too weak to busy himself henceforward with the affairs of his duchy, to the castle of Pavia, where he lay and languished under the eyes of his wife Isabella, daughter of King Ferdinand of Naples. As to Ludovico, he was an ambitious man, full of courage and astuteness, familiar with the sword and with poison, which he used alternately according to the occasion, without feeling any repugnance or any predilection for either of them, but quite decided to be his nephew's heir, whether he died or lived. Florence, although she had preserved the name of a republic, had little by little lost all her liberties, and belonged in fact, if not by right, to Piero dei Medici, to whom she had been bequeathed as a paternal legacy by Lorenzo, as we have seen, at the risk of his soul's salvation. The son, unfortunately, was far from having the genius of his father. He was handsome, it is true, whereas Lorenzo, on the contrary, was remarkably ugly. He had an agreeable musical voice, whereas Lorenzo had always spoken through his nose. He was instructed in Latin and Greek, his conversation was pleasant and easy, and he improvised verses almost as well as the so-called magnificent. But he was both ignorant of political affairs, and haughtily insolent in his behavior to those who had made them their study. Added to this, he was an ardent lover of pleasure, passionately addicted to women, incessantly occupied with bodily exercises that should make him shine in their eyes, above all with tennis, a game at which he very highly excelled. He promised himself that, when the period of mourning was past, he would occupy the attention not only of Florence but of the whole of Italy by the splendor of his courts and the renown of his fetes. Piero dei Medici had at any rate formed this plan, but heaven decreed otherwise. As to the most serene Republic of Venice, whose doge was Agostino Barbarigo, she had attained, at the time we have reached, to her highest degree of power and splendor. From Cadiz to the Palace Meotis, there was no port that was not open to her 1,000 ships. She possessed in Italy, beyond the coast line of the canals and the ancient duchy of Venice, the provinces of Bergamo, Brescia, Crema, Verona, Vicenza, and Padua. She owned the marches of Treviso, which comprehend the districts of Feltre, Belluno, Cadore, Policella of Rovigo, and the Principality of Ravenna. She also owned the Friuli except Aquileia, Istria except Trieste. She owned on the east side of the Gulf Zara, Spalatra, and the shore of Albania; in the Ionian Sea the islands of Zante and Corfu; in Greece Lepanto and Patras; in the Morea Moroni, Corone, Neapolis, and Argos; lastly, in the archipelago, besides several little towns and stations on the coast, she owned Candia and the kingdom of Cyprus. Thus, from the mouth of the Po to the eastern extremity of the Mediterranean, the most serene Republic was mistress of the whole coast line, and Italy and Greece seemed to be mere suburbs of Venice. In the intervals of space left free between Naples, Milan, Florence, and Venice, petty tyrants had arisen who exercised an absolute sovereignty over their territories. Thus the Colonnos were at Ostia and at Nettuno, the Montefeltri at Urbino, the Manfredi at Faenza, the Bentivogli at Bologna, the Malatesta family at Rimini, the Vitelli at Città di Castello, the Baglioni at Perugia, the Orsini at Vicovaro, and the princes of Este at Ferrara. Finally, in the center of this immense circle, composed of great powers, of secondary states, and of little tyrannies, Rome was set on high, the most exalted, yet the weakest of all, without influence, without lands, without an army, without gold. It was the concern of the new pope to secure all this. Let us see, therefore, what manner of man was this Alexander VI for undertaking and accomplishing such a project. End of section 4. Section 5 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas, translated by G.B. Ives. Section 5, The Borgias, Chapter 3, Part 1. Rodrigo Lenzuolo was born at Valencia in Spain in 1430 or 1431, and on his mother's side was descended, as some writers declare, of a family of royal blood which had cast its eyes on the tiara only after cherishing hopes of the crowns of Aragon and Valencia. Rodrigo from his infancy had shown signs of a marvelous quickness of mind, and as he grew older he exhibited an intelligence extremely apt for the study of sciences, especially law and jurisprudence. The result was that his first distinctions were gained in the law, a profession wherein he soon made a great reputation by his ability in the discussion of the most thorny cases. All the same, he was not slow to leave this career, and abandoned it quite suddenly for the military profession which his father had followed. But after various actions which served to display his presence of mind and courage, he was as much disgusted with this profession as with the other. And since it happened that at the very time he began to feel this disgust his father died, leaving a considerable fortune, he resolved to do no more work, but to live according to his own fancies and caprices. About this time he became the lover of a widow who had 2 daughters. The widow dying, Rodrigo took the girls under his protection, put one into a convent, and as the other was one of the loveliest women imaginable, made her his mistress. This was the notorious Rosa Venozza, by whom he had 5 children, Francesco, Cesar, Lucrezia, and Goffredo. The name of the 5th is unknown. Rodrigo, retired from public affairs, was given up entirely to the affections of a lover and a father, when he heard that his uncle, who loved him like a son, had been elected pope under the name of Calixtus III. But the young man was at this time so much a lover that love imposed silence on ambition, and indeed he was almost terrified at the exaltation of his uncle, which was no doubt destined to force him once more into public life. Consequently, instead of hurrying to Rome as anyone else in his place would have done, he was content to indite to His Holiness a letter in which he begged for the continuation of his favors and wished him a long and happy reign. This reserve on the part of one of his relatives, contrasted with the ambitious schemes which beset the new pope at every step, struck Calixtus III in a singular way. He knew the stuff that was in young Rodrigo, and at a time when he was besieged on all sides by mediocrities, this powerful nature holding modestly aside gained new grandeur in his eyes, so he replied instantly to Rodrigo that on the receipt of his letter he must quit Spain for Italy, Valencia for Rome. This letter uprooted Rodrigo from the center of happiness he had created for himself. and where he might perhaps have slumbered on like an ordinary man if fortune had not thus interposed to drag him forcibly away. Rodrigo was happy. Rodrigo was rich. The evil passions which were natural to him had been, if not extinguished, at least lulled. He was frightened himself at the idea of changing the quiet life he was leading for the ambitious, agitated career that was promised him, and instead of obeying his uncle, he delayed the preparations for departure, hoping that Calixtus would forget him. It was not so. 2 months after he received the letter from the Pope, there arrived at Valencia a prelate from Rome, the bearer of Rodrigo's nomination to a benefice worth 20,000 ducats a year, and also a positive order to the holder of the post to come and take possession of his charge as soon as possible. Holding back was no longer feasible, so Rodrigo obeyed. But as he did not wish to be separated from the source whence had sprung 8 years of happiness, Rosa Venotza also left Spain, and while he was going to Rome, she betook herself to Venice, accompanied by 2 confidential servants, and under the protection of a Spanish gentleman named Manuel Melchior. Fortune kept the promises she had made to Rodrigo. The Pope received him as a son, and made him successively Archbishop of Valencia, Cardinal Deacon, and Vice-Chancellor. To all these favours Calixtus added a revenue of 20,000 ducats, so that at the age of scarcely 35 Rodrigo found himself the equal of a prince in riches and power. Rodrigo had had some reluctance about accepting the cardinalship, which kept him fast at Rome, and would have preferred to be general of the Church, a position which would have allowed him more liberty for seeing his mistress and his family. But his uncle Calixtus made him reckon with the possibility of being his successor some day, and from that moment the idea of being the supreme head of kings and nations took such hold of Rodrigo that he no longer had any end in view but that which his uncle had made him entertain. From that day forward there began to grow up in the young cardinal that talent for hypocrisy which made of him the most perfect incarnation of the devil that has perhaps ever existed, and Rodrigo was no longer the same man. With words of repentance and humility on his lips, his head bowed as though he were bearing the weight of his past sins, disparaging the riches which he had acquired, and which, according to him, were the wealth of the poor and ought to return to the poor, he passed his life in churches, monasteries, and hospitals, acquiring, his historian tells us, even in the eyes of his enemies, the reputation of a Solomon for wisdom, of a Job for patience, and of a very Moses for his promulgation of the word of God. Rosa Venotza was the only person in the world who could appreciate the value of this pious cardinal's conversion. It proved a lucky thing for Rodrigo that he had assumed this pious attitude, for his protector died after a reign of 3 years, 3 months, and 19 days, and he was now sustained by his own merit alone against the numerous enemies he had made by his rapid rise to fortune. So, during the whole of the reign of Pius II, he lived always apart from public affairs, and only reappeared in the days of Sixtus IV, who made him the gift of the abbacy of Subiaco, and sent him in the capacity of ambassador to the kings of Aragon and Portugal. On his return, which took place during the pontificate of Innocent VIII, he decided to fetch his family at last to Rome. Thither they came, escorted by Don Manuel Melchior, who from that moment passed as the husband of Rosa Venotza, and took the name of Count Ferdinand of Castile. The Cardinal Rodrigo received the noble Spaniard as a countryman and a friend, and he, who expected to lead a most retired life, engaged a house in the street of the Lungara, near the church of Regina Caeli, on the banks of the Tiber. There it was that, after passing the day in prayers and pious works, Cardinal Rodrigo used to repair each evening and lay aside his mask. And it was said, though nobody could prove it, that in this house infamous scenes passed. Report said the dissipations were of so dissolute a character that their equals had never been seen in Rome. With a view to checking the rumours that began to spread abroad, Rodrigo sent Caesar to study in Pisa, and married Lucretia to a young gentleman of Aragon. Thus there only remained at home Rosa Venozza and her 2 sons. Such was the state of things when Innocent VIII died, and Rodrigo Borgia was proclaimed Pope. We have seen by what means the nomination was effected, and so the 5 cardinals who had taken no part in this simony, namely the Cardinals of Naples, Sierra, Portugal, Santa Maria in Portico, and St. Peter in Vinculus, protested loudly against this election, which they treated as a piece of jobbery. But Rodrigo had none the less, however it was done, secured his majority. Rodrigo was none the less the 260th successor of St. Peter. Alexander VI, however, though he had arrived at his object, did not dare throw off at first the mask which the Cardinal Borgia had worn so long, although when he was apprised of his election he could not dissimulate his joy. Indeed, on hearing the favourable result of the scrutiny, he lifted his hands to heaven and cried, in the accents of satisfied ambition, "Am I then Pope? Am I then Christ's vicar? Am I then the keystone of the Christian world?" "Yes, Holy Father," replied Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, the same who had sold to Rodrigo the 9 votes that were at his disposal at the conclave for 4 mules laden with silver, "and we hope by your election to give glory to God, repose to the Church, and joy to Christendom, seeing that you have been chosen by the Almighty Himself as the most worthy among all your brethren." But in the short interval occupied by this reply, the new Pope had already assumed papal authority, and in a humble voice, and with hands crossed upon his breast, he spoke: "We hope that God will grant us His powerful aid, in spite of our weakness, and that He will do for us that which He did for the Apostle, when aforetime He put into his hands the keys of heaven, and entrusted to him the government of the Church, a government which, without the aid of God, would prove too heavy a burden for mortal man. But God promised that His Spirit should direct him. God will do the same, I trust, for us, and for your part we fear not lest any of you fail in that holy obedience which is due unto the head of the Church, even as the flock of Christ was bidden to follow the Prince of the Apostles." Having spoken these words, Alexander donned the pontifical robes, and through the windows of the Vatican had strips of paper thrown out, on which his name was written in Latin. These, blown by the wind, seemed to convey to the whole world the news of the great event which was about to change the face of Italy. The same day, couriers started for all the courts of Europe. Caesar Borgia learned the news of his father's election at the University of Pisa, where he was a student. His ambition had sometimes dreamed of such good fortune, yet his joy was little short of madness. He was then a young man, about 22 or 24 years of age, skilful in all bodily exercises, and especially in fencing. He could ride barebacked the most fiery of steeds, could cut off the head of a bull at a single sword stroke. Moreover, he was arrogant, jealous, and insincere. According to Tomasi, he was great among the godless, as his brother Francesco was good among the great. As to his face, even contemporary authors have left utterly different descriptions, for some have painted him as a monster of ugliness, while others, on the contrary, extol his beauty. This contradiction is due to the fact that at certain times of the year, and especially in the spring, his face was covered with an eruption which, so long as it lasted, made him an object of horror and disgust, while all the rest of the year he was the sombre, black-haired cavalier with pale skin and tawny beard, whom Raphael shows us in the fine portrait he made of him. And historians, both chroniclers and painters, agree as to his fixed and powerful gaze, behind which burned a ceaseless flame, giving to his face something infernal and superhuman. Such was the man whose fortune was to fulfill all his desires. He had taken for his motto, Aut Caesar, aut nihil, Caesar, or nothing. End of section 5. Section 6 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 6, The Borgias, Chapter 3, Part 2. Caesar posted to Rome with certain of his friends, and scarcely was he recognized at the gates of the city when the deference shown to him gave instant proof of the change in his fortunes. At the Vatican the respect was twice as great. Mighty men bowed down before him as before one mightier than themselves. And so, in his impatience, he stayed not to visit his mother or any other member of his family, but went straight to the Pope to kiss his feet. And as the Pope had been forewarned of his coming, he awaited him in the midst of a brilliant and numerous assemblage of cardinals, with the 3 other brothers standing behind him. His Holiness received Caesar with a gracious countenance. Still he did not allow himself any demonstration of his paternal love, but, bending towards him, kissed him on the forehead, and inquired how he was, and how he had fared on his journey. Caesar replied that he was wonderfully well, and altogether at the service of his Holiness; that as to the journey, the trifling inconveniences and short fatigue had been compensated, and far more than compensated, by the joy which he felt in being able to adore upon the papal throne a Pope who was so worthy. At these words, leaving Caesar still on his knees, and reseating himself, for he had risen from his seat to embrace him, the Pope assumed a grave and composed expression of face, and spoke as follows, loud enough to be heard by all, and slowly enough for everyone present to be able to ponder and retain in his memory even the least of his words. "We are convinced, Caesar, that you are peculiarly rejoiced in beholding us on this sublime height, so far above our deserts, whereto it has pleased the divine goodness to exalt us. This joy of yours is first of all our due because of the love we have always borne you, and which we bear you still; and in the second place is prompted by your own personal interest, since henceforth you may feel sure of receiving from our pontifical hand those benefits which your own good works shall deserve. But if your joy, and this we say to you as we have even now said to your brothers, if your joy is founded on aught else than this, you are very greatly mistaken, Caesar, and you will find yourself sadly deceived. Perhaps we have been ambitious. We confess this humbly before the face of all men, passionately and immoderately ambitious to attain to the dignity of Sovereign Pontiff. And to reach this end we have followed every path that is open to human industry. But we have acted thus, vowing an inward vow that when once we had reached our goal, we would follow no other path but that which conduces best to the service of God and to the advancement of the Holy See, so that the glorious memory of the deeds that we shall do may efface the shameful recollection of the deeds we have already done. Thus shall we, let us hope, leave to those who follow us a track, whereupon, if they find not the footsteps of a saint, they may at least tread in the path of a true pontiff. God, who has furthered the means, claims at our hands the fruits, and we desire to discharge to the full this mighty debt that we have incurred to him. And accordingly we refuse to arouse by any deceit the stern rigor of his judgments. One sole hindrance could have power to shake our good intentions, and that might happen should we feel too keen an interest in your fortunes. Therefore are we armed beforehand against our love, and therefore have we prayed to God beforehand that we stumble not because of you. For in the path of favoritism a pope cannot slip without a fall, and cannot fall without injury and dishonor to the Holy See. Even to the end of our life we shall deplore the faults which have brought this experience home to us, and may it please God that our Uncle Calixtus, of blessed memory, bear not this day in purgatory the burden of our sins, more heavy, alas, than his own. Ah, he was rich in every virtue, he was full of good intentions, but he loved too much his own people, and among them he loved me chief. And so he suffered this love to lead him blindly astray, all this love that he bore to his kindred, who to him were too truly flesh of his flesh, so that he heaped upon the heads of a few persons only, and those perhaps the least worthy, benefits which would more fittingly have rewarded the deserts of many. In truth, he bestowed upon our house treasures that should never have been amassed at the expense of the poor, or else should have been turned to a better purpose. He severed from the ecclesiastical state, already weak and poor, the duchy of Spoleto and other wealthy properties, that he might make them fiefs to us. He confided to our weak hands the vice-chancellorship, the vice-prefecture of Rome, the generalship of the Church, and all the other most important offices, which, instead of being monopolized by us, should have been conferred on those who were most meritorious. Moreover, there were persons who were raised on our recommendation to posts of great dignity, although they had no claims but such as our undue partiality accorded them. Others were left out with no reason for their failure except the jealousy excited in us by their virtues. To rob Ferdinand of Aragon of the kingdom of Naples, Calixtus kindled a terrible war, which by a happy issue only served to increase our fortune, and by an unfortunate issue must have brought shame and disaster upon the Holy See. Lastly, by allowing himself to be governed by men who sacrificed public good to their private interests, he inflicted an injury not only upon the pontifical throne and his own reputation, but what is far worse, far more deadly, upon his own conscience. And yet, O wise judgments of God, hard and incessantly though he toiled to establish our fortunes, scarcely had he left empty that supreme seat which we occupy today, when we were cast down from the pinnacle whereon we had climbed, abandoned to the fury of the rabble and the vindictive hatred of the Roman barons, who chose to feel offended by our goodness to their enemies. Thus, not only, we tell you, Caesar, not only did we plunge headlong from the summit of our grandeur, losing the worldly goods and dignities which our uncle had heaped at our feet, but for very peril of our life we were condemned to a voluntary exile, we and our friends, and in this way only did we contrive to escape the storm which our too good fortune had stirred up against us. Now this is a plain proof that God mocks at men's designs when they are bad ones. How great an error is it for any pope to devote more care to the welfare of a house, which cannot last more than a few years, than to the glory of the Church, which will last forever. What utter folly for any public man whose position is not inherited, and cannot be bequeathed to his posterity, to support the edifice of his grandeur on any other basis than the noblest virtue practised for the general good, and to suppose that he can ensure the continuance of his own fortune otherwise than by taking all precautions against sudden whirlwinds which are wont to arise in the midst of a calm, and to blow up the storm clouds, I mean the host of enemies. Now any one of these enemies who does his worst can cause injuries far more powerful than any help that is at all likely to come from 100 friends and their lying promises. If you and your brothers walk in the path of virtue which we shall now open for you, every wish of your heart shall be instantly accomplished. But if you take the other path, if you have ever hoped that our affection will wink at disorderly life, then you will very soon find out that we are truly Pope, Father of the Church, not Father of the family; that, Vicar of Christ as we are, we shall act as we deem best for Christendom, and not as you deem best for your own private good. And now that we have come to a thorough understanding, Caesar, receive our pontifical blessing." And with these words Alexander VI rose up, laid his hands upon his son's head, for Caesar was still kneeling, and then retired into his apartments without inviting him to follow. The young man remained a while stupefied at this discourse, so utterly unexpected, so utterly destructive at one fell blow to his most cherished hopes. He rose giddy and staggering like a drunken man, and at once leaving the Vatican, hurried to his mother, whom he had forgotten before, but sought now in his despair. Rosa Venozza possessed all the vices and all the virtues of a Spanish courtesan. Her devotion to the Virgin amounted to superstition, her fondness for her children to weakness, and her love for Rodrigo to sensuality. In the depth of her heart she relied on the influence she had been able to exercise over him for nearly 30 years, and like a snake she knew how to envelop him in her coils when the fascination of her glance had lost its power. Rosa knew of old the profound hypocrisy of her lover, and thus she was in no difficulty about reassuring Cæsar. Lucrezia was with her mother when Cæsar arrived. The two young people exchanged a lover-like kiss beneath her very eyes, and before he left, Cæsar had made an appointment for the same evening with Lucrezia, who was now living apart from her husband, to whom Rodrigo paid a pension, in her palace of the Via del Pellegrino, opposite the Campo dei Fiori, and there enjoying perfect liberty. In the evening, at the hour fixed, Cæsar appeared at Lucrezia's, but he found there his brother Francesco. The two young men had never been friends; still, as their tastes were very different, hatred with Francesco was only the fear of the deer for the hunter, but with Cæsar it was the desire for vengeance, and that lust for blood which lurks perpetually in the heart of a tiger. The two brothers none the less embraced, one from general kindly feeling, the other from hypocrisy. But at first sight of one another the sentiment of a double rivalry, first in their father's and then in their sister's good graces, had sent the blood mantling to the cheek of Francesco, and called a deadly pallor into Cæsar's. So the two young men sat on, each resolved not to be the first to leave, when all at once there was a knock at the door, and a rival was announced before whom both of them were bound to give way. It was their father. Rosa Venozza was quite right in comforting Cæsar. Indeed, although Alexander VI had repudiated the abuses of nepotism, he understood very well the part that was to be played for his benefit by his sons and his daughter, for he knew he could always count on Lucrezia and Cæsar, if not on Francesco and Goffredo. In these matters the sister was quite worthy of her brother. Lucrezia was wanton in imagination, godless by nature, ambitious and designing. She had a craving for pleasure, admiration, honors, money, jewels, gorgeous stuffs, and magnificent mansions. A true Spaniard beneath her golden tresses, the courtesan beneath her frank looks, she carried the head of a Raphael Madonna, and concealed the heart of a Messalina. She was dear to Rodrigo both as daughter and as mistress, and he saw himself reflected in her as in a magic mirror, every passion and every vice. Lucrezia and Cæsar were accordingly the best beloved of his heart, and the three composed that diabolical trio which for 11 years occupied the pontifical throne, like a mocking parody of the heavenly Trinity. Nothing occurred at first to give the lie to Alexander's professions of principle in the discourse he addressed to Cæsar, and the first year of his pontificate exceeded all the hopes of Rome at the time of his election. He arranged for the provision of stores in the public granaries with such liberality that within the memory of man there had never been such astonishing abundance. And with a view to extending the general prosperity to the lowest class, he organized numerous doles to be paid out of his private fortune, which made it possible for the very poor to participate in the general banquet from which they had been excluded for long enough. The safety of the city was secured from the very first days of his accession by the establishment of a strong and vigilant police force, and a tribunal consisting of 4 magistrates of irreproachable character, empowered to prosecute all nocturnal crimes, which during the last pontificate had been so common that their very numbers made impunity certain. These judges from the first showed a severity which neither the rank nor the purse of the culprit could modify. This presented such a great contrast to the corruption of the last reign, in the course of which the Vice Chamberlain one day remarked in public, when certain people were complaining of the venality of justice, "God wills not that a sinner die, but that he live and pay," that the capital of the Christian world felt for one brief moment restored to the happy days of the papacy. So, at the end of a year, Alexander VI. Had reconquered that spiritual credit, so to speak, which his predecessors lost. His political credit was still to be established, if he was to carry out the first part of his gigantic scheme. To arrive at this he must employ two agencies, alliances and conquests. His plan was to begin with alliances. The gentleman of Aragon who had married Lucrezia when she was only the daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia was not a man powerful enough, either by birth and fortune or by intellect, to enter with any sort of effect into the plots and plans of Alexander VI. The separation was therefore changed into a divorce, and Lucrezia Borgia was now free to remarry. Alexander opened up two negotiations at the same time. He needed an ally to keep a watch on the policy of the neighboring states. John Sforza, grandson of Alexander Sforza, brother of the great Francis I, Duke of Milan, was Lord of Pesaro. The geographical situation of this place, on the coast, on the way between Florence and Venice, was wonderfully convenient for his purpose. So Alexander first cast an eye upon him, and as the interest of both parties was evidently the same, it came about that John Sforza was very soon Lucrezia's second husband. At the same time overtures had been made to Alfonso of Aragon, heir presumptive to the crown of Naples, to arrange a marriage between Dona Sancia, his illegitimate daughter, and Goffredo, the Pope's third son. But as the old Ferdinand wanted to make the best bargain he could out of it, he dragged on the negotiations as long as possible, urging that the two children were not of marriageable age, and so, highly honored as he felt in such a prospective alliance, there was no hurry about the engagement. Matters stopped at this point, to the great annoyance of Alexander VI., who saw through this excuse, and understood that the postponement was nothing more or less than a refusal. Accordingly, Alexander and Ferdinand remained in statu quo, equals in the political game, both on the watch till events should declare for one or other. The turn of fortune was for Alexander. Italy, though tranquil, was instinctively conscious that her calm was nothing but the lull which goes before a storm. She was too rich and too happy to escape the envy of other nations. As yet the plains of Pisa had not been reduced to marshlands by the combined negligence and jealousy of the Florentine Republic. Neither had the rich country that lay around Rome been converted into a barren desert by the wars of the Colonna and Orsini families. Not yet had the Marquis of Marignan razed to the ground 120 villages in the Republic of Siena alone, and though the Maremma was unhealthy, it was not yet a poisonous marsh. It is a fact that Flavio Blondo, writing in 1450, describes Ostia as being merely less flourishing than in the days of the Romans, when she had numbered 50,000 inhabitants, whereas now in our own day there are barely 30 in all. The Italian peasants were perhaps the most blessed on the face of the earth. Instead of living scattered about the country in solitary fashion, they lived in villages that were enclosed by walls as a protection for their harvests, animals, and farm implements. Their houses, at any rate those that yet stand, prove that they lived in much more comfortable and beautiful surroundings than the ordinary townsmen of our day. Further, there was a community of interests, and many people collected together in the fortified villages, with the result that little by little they attained to an importance never acquired by the boorish French peasants or the German serfs. They bore arms, they had a common treasury, they elected their own magistrates, and whenever they went out to fight, it was to save their common country. Also, commerce was no less flourishing than agriculture. Italy at this period was rich in industries: silk, wool, hemp, fur, alum, sulphur, bitumen. Those products which the Italian soil could not bring forth were imported from the Black Sea, from Egypt, from Spain, from France, and often returned whence they came, their worth doubled by labor and fine workmanship. The rich man brought his merchandise, the poor his industry. The one was sure of finding workmen, the other was sure of finding work. Art also was by no means behindhand. Dante, Giotto, Brunelleschi, and Donatello were dead, but Ariosto, Raphael, Bramante, and Michelangelo were now living. Rome, Florence, and Naples had inherited the masterpieces of antiquity, and the manuscripts of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides had come, thanks to the conquest of Mohammed II, to rejoin the statue of Xanthippus and the works of Phidias and Praxiteles. The principal sovereigns of Italy had come to understand, when they let their eyes dwell upon the fat harvests, the wealthy villages, the flourishing manufactories, and the marvelous churches, and then compared with them the poor and rude nations of fighting men who surrounded them on all sides, that some day or other they were destined to become for other countries what America was for Spain, a vast gold mine for them to work. In consequence of this, a league offensive and defensive had been signed, about 1480, by Naples, Milan, Florence, and Ferrara, prepared to take a stand against enemies within or without, in Italy or outside. Ludovico Sforza, who was more than anyone else interested in maintaining this league, because he was nearest to France, whence the storm seemed to threaten, saw in the new Pope's election means not only of strengthening the league, but of making its power and unity conspicuous in the sight of Europe. End of section 6. Section 7 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 7. The Borgias. Chapter 4, Part 1. On the occasion of each new election to the papacy, it is the custom for all the Christian states to send a solemn embassy to Rome, to renew their oath of allegiance to the Holy Father. Ludovico Sforza conceived the idea that the ambassadors of the four powers should unite and make their entry into Rome on the same day, appointing one of their envoy, viz., the representative of the King of Naples, to be spokesman for all four. Unluckily, this plan did not agree with the magnificent projects of Piero de' Medici. That proud youth, who had been appointed ambassador of the Florentine Republic, had seen in the mission entrusted to him by his fellow citizens the means of making a brilliant display of his own wealth. From the day of his nomination onwards, his palace was constantly filled with tailors, jewelers, and merchants of priceless stuffs. Magnificent clothes had been made for him embroidered with precious stones which he had selected from the family treasures. All his jewels, perhaps the richest in Italy, were distributed about the liveries of his pages, and one of them, his favorite, was to wear a collar of pearls valued by itself at 100,000 ducats, or almost 1,000,000 of our francs. In his party, the Bishop of Arezzo, Gentile, who had once been Lorenzo de' Medici's tutor, was elected as second ambassador, and it was his duty to speak. Now Gentile, who had prepared his speech, counted on his eloquence to charm the ear, quite as much as Piero counted on his riches to dazzle the eye. But the eloquence of Gentile would be lost completely if nobody was to speak but the ambassador of the King of Naples, and the magnificence of Piero de' Medici would never be noticed at all if he went to Rome mixed up with all the other ambassadors. These two important interests, compromised by the Duke of Milan's proposition, changed the whole face of Italy. Ludovico Sforza had already made sure of Ferdinand's promise to conform to the plan he had invented, when the old king, at the solicitation of Piero, suddenly drew back. Sforza found out how this change had come about, and learned that it was Piero's influence that had overmastered his own. He could not disentangle the real motives that had promised the change, and imagined that there was some secret league against himself. He attributed the changed political program to the death of Lorenzo de' Medici. But whatever its cause might be, it was evidently prejudicial to his own interests. Florence, Milan's old ally, was abandoning her for Naples. He resolved to throw a counterweight into the scales, so, betraying to Alexander the policy of Piero and Ferdinand, he proposed to form a defensive and offensive alliance with him, and admit the Republic of Venice. Duke Hercule III of Ferrara was also to be summoned to pronounce for one or the other of the two leagues. Alexander VI, wounded by Ferdinand's treatment of himself, accepted Ludovico Sforza's proposition, and an act of confederation was signed on the 22nd of April, 1493, by which the new allies pledged themselves to set on foot, for the maintenance of the public peace, an army of 20,000 horse and 6,000 infantry. Ferdinand was frightened when he beheld the formation of this league, but he thought he could neutralize its effects by depriving Ludovico Sforza of his regency, which he had already kept beyond the proper time, though as yet he was not strictly an usurper. Although the young Galeazzo, his nephew, had reached the age of 22, Ludovico Sforza none the less continued regent. Now Ferdinand definitely proposed to the Duke of Milan that he should resign the sovereign power into the hands of his nephew, on pain of being declared an usurper. This was a bold stroke, but there was a risk of inciting Ludovico Sforza to start one of those political plots that he was so familiar with, never recoiling from any situation, however dangerous it might be. This was exactly what happened. Sforza, uneasy about his duchy, resolved to threaten Ferdinand's kingdom. Nothing could be easier. He knew the warlike notions of Charles VIII and the pretensions of the House of France to the kingdom of Naples. He sent 2 ambassadors to invite the young king to claim the rights of Anjou usurped by Aragon, and with a view to reconciling Charles to so distant and hazardous an expedition, offered him a free and friendly passage through his own states. Such a proposition was welcome to Charles VIII, as we might suppose from our knowledge of his character. A magnificent prospect was opened to him as by an enchanter. What Ludovico Sforza was offering him was virtually the command of the Mediterranean, the protectorship of the whole of Italy. It was an open road through Naples and Venice that well might lead to the conquest of Turkey or the Holy Land, if he ever had the fancy to avenge the disasters of Nicopolis and Mansura. So the proposition was accepted, and a secret alliance was signed with Count Charles di Belgiojoso and the Count of Cajazza, acting for Ludovico Sforza, and the Bishop of St. Malo and Seneschal de Beaucaire for Charles VIII. By this treaty it was agreed that the King of France should attempt the conquest of the kingdom of Naples, that the Duke of Milan should grant a passage to the King of France through his territories, and accompany him with 500 lances, that the Duke of Milan should permit the King of France to send out as many ships of war as he pleased from Genoa. Lastly, that the Duke of Milan should lend the King of France 200,000 ducats, payable when he started. On his side Charles VIII agreed to defend the personal authority of Ludovico Sforza over the Duchy of Milan against anyone who might attempt to turn him out, to keep 200 French lances always in readiness to help the house of Sforza at Asti, a town belonging to the Duke of Orleans by the inheritance of his mother Valentina Visconti. Lastly, to hand over to his ally the Principality of Tarentum immediately after the conquest of Naples was effected. This treaty was scarcely concluded when Charles VIII, who exaggerated its advantages, began to dream of freeing himself from every let or hindrance to the expedition. Precautions were necessary, for his relations with the great powers were far from being what he could have wished. Indeed, Henry VII had disembarked at Calais with a formidable army, and was threatening France with another invasion. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, if they had not assisted at the fall of the House of Anjou, had at any rate helped the Aragon party with men and money. Lastly, the war with the Emperor acquired a fresh impetus when Charles VIII sent back Margaret of Burgundy to her father Maximilian, and contracted a marriage with Anne of Brittany. By the Treaty of Étaples on the 3rd of November, 1492, Henry VII cancelled the alliance with the King of the Romans, and pledged himself not to follow his conquests. This cost Charles VIII 745,000 gold crowns and the expenses of the war with England. By the Treaty of Barcelona, dated the 19th of January, 1493, Ferdinand the Catholic and Isabella agreed never to grant aid to their cousin Ferdinand of Naples, and never to put obstacles in the way of the French king in Italy. This cost Charles VIII Perpignan, Roussillon, and the Cerdagne, which had all been given to Louis XI as a hostage for the sum of 300,000 ducats by John of Aragon, but at the time agreed upon Louis XI would not give them up for the money, for the old fox knew very well how important were these doors to the Pyrenees, and proposed in case of war to keep them shut. Lastly, by the Treaty of Senlis, dated the 23rd of May, 1493, Maximilian granted a gracious pardon to France for the insult her king had offered him. It cost Charles VIII the counties of Burgundy, Artois, Charolais, and the seigneury of Noyers, which had come to him as Margaret's dowry, and also the towns of Aire, Hesdin, and Bethune, which he promised to deliver up to Philip of Austria on the day he came of age. By dint of all these sacrifices the young king made peace with his neighbours, and could set on foot the enterprise that Ludovico Sforza had proposed. We have already explained that the project came into Sforza's mind when his plan about the deputation was refused, and that the refusal was due to Piero de' Medici's desire to make an exhibition of his magnificent jewels, and Gentili's desire to make his speech. Thus the vanity of a tutor and the pride of his scholar together combined to agitate the civilized world from the Gulf of Tarentum to the Pyrenees. Alexander VI was in the very centre of the impending earthquake, and before Italy had any idea that the earliest shocks were at hand, he had profited by the perturbed preoccupation of other people to give the lie to that famous speech we have reported. He created Cardinal John Borgia, a nephew, who during the last pontificate had been elected Archbishop of Montreal and Governor of Rome. This promotion caused no discontent because of John's antecedents, and Alexander, encouraged by the success of this, promised to Cesar Borgia the Archbishopric of Valencia, a benefice he had himself enjoyed before his elevation to the papacy. But here the difficulty arose on the side of the recipient. The young man, full-blooded, with all the vices and natural instincts of a captain of condottieri, had very great trouble in assuming even the appearance of a churchman's virtue. But as he knew from his own father's mouth that the highest secular dignities were reserved for his elder brother, he decided to take what he could get, for fear of getting nothing. But his hatred for Francesco grew stronger, for from henceforth he was doubly his rival, both in love and ambition. Suddenly Alexander beheld the old King Ferdinand returning to his side, and at the very moment when he least expected it. The Pope was too clever a politician to accept a reconciliation without finding out the cause of it. He soon learned what plots were hatching at the French court against the kingdom of Naples, and the whole situation was explained. Now it was his turn to impose conditions. He demanded the completion of a marriage between Goffredo, his third son, and Dona Sancia, Alfonso's illegitimate daughter. He demanded that she should bring her husband as dowry the Principality of Squillace and the County of Cariati, with an income of 10,000 ducats and the office of protonotary, one of the 7 great crown offices which are independent of royal control. He demanded for his eldest son whom Ferdinand the Catholic had just made Duke of Gandia, the Principality of Tricarico, the counties of Chiaramonte, Loria, and Carinola, an income of 12,000 ducats, and the first of the 7 great offices which should fall vacant. He demanded that Virginio Orsini, his ambassador at the Neapolitan court, should be given a 3rd great office, viz. That of constable, the most important of them all. Lastly, he demanded that Giuliano della Rovera, one of the 5 cardinals who had opposed his election and was now taking refuge at Ostia, where the oak whence he took his name and bearings is still to be seen carved on all the walls, should be driven out of that town, and the town itself given over to him. In exchange he merely pledged himself never to withdraw from the House of Aragon the investiture of the kingdom of Naples accorded by his predecessors. Ferdinand was paying somewhat dearly for a simple promise, but on the keeping of this promise the legitimacy of his power wholly depended. For the kingdom of Naples was a fief to the Holy See, and to the Pope alone belonged the right of pronouncing on the justice of each competitor's pretensions. The continuance of this investiture was therefore of the highest conceivable importance to Aragon, just at the time when Anjou was rising up with an army at her back to dispossess her. For a year after he mounted the papal throne, Alexander VI had made great strides, as we see, in the extension of his temporal power. In his own hands he held, to be sure, only the least in size of the Italian territories. But by the marriage of his daughter Lucrezia with the Lord of Pesaro, he was stretching out one hand as far as Venice, while by the marriage of the Prince of Squillace with Dona Sansia, and the territories conceded to the Duke of Gandia, he was touching with the other hand the boundary of Calabria. When this treaty, so advantageous for himself, was duly signed, he made Cæsar Cardinal of Santa Maria Novella, for Cæsar was always complaining of being left out in the distribution of his father's favours. Only, as there was as yet no precedent in church history for a bastard's donning the scarlet, the Pope hunted up 4 false witnesses, who declared that Cæsar was the son of Count Ferdinand of Castile, who was, as we know, that valuable person, Don Manuel Melchior, and who played the father's part with just as much solemnity as he had played the husband's. The wedding of the 2 bastards was most splendid, rich with the double pomp of church and king. As the Pope had settled that the young bridal pair should live near him, Cæsar Borgia, the new cardinal, undertook to manage the ceremony of their entry into Rome and the reception, and Lucrezia, who enjoyed at her father's side an amount of favour hitherto unheard of at the papal court, desired on her part to contribute all the splendour she had it in her power to add. He therefore went to receive the young people with a stately and magnificent escort of lords and cardinals, while she awaited them, attended by the loveliest and noblest ladies of Rome, in one of the halls of the Vatican. A throne was there prepared for the Pope, and at his feet were cushions for Lucrezia and Dona Sansia. "Thus," writes Tommaso Tommasi, "by the look of the assembly, and the sort of conversation that went on for hours, you would suppose you were present at some magnificent and voluptuous royal audience of ancient Assyria, rather than at the severe consistory of a Roman pontiff, whose solemn duty it is to exhibit in every act the sanctity of the name he bears." But, continues the same historian, if the eve of Pentecost was spent in such worthy functions, the celebrations of the coming of the Holy Ghost on the following day were no less decorous and becoming to the spirit of the Church, for thus writes the master of the ceremonies in his journal: "The Pope made his entry into the Church of the Holy Apostles, and beside him on the marble steps of the pulpit, where the canons of St. Peter are wont to chant the Epistle and Gospel, sat Lucrezia his daughter, and Sansia his son's wife. Round about them, a disgrace to the Church and a public scandal, were grouped a number of other Roman ladies, far more fit to dwell in Messalina's city than in St. Peter's." So at Rome and Naples did men slumber while ruin was at hand. So did they waste their time and squander their money in a vain display of pride, and this was going on while the French, thoroughly alive, were busy laying hands upon the torches with which they would presently set Italy on fire. Indeed, the designs of Charles VIII. For conquest were no longer for anybody a matter of doubt. The young king had sent an embassy to the various Italian states, composed of Peron dei Baschi, Brigonnet, d'Aubigny, and the president of the Provençal Parliament. The mission of this embassy was to demand from the Italian princes their cooperation in recovering the rights of the crown of Naples for the house of Anjou. The embassy first approached the Venetians, demanding aid and counsel for the king their master. But the Venetians, faithful to their political tradition, which had gained for them the sobriquet of the Jews of Christendom, replied that they were not in a position to give any aid to the young king, so long as they had to keep ceaselessly on guard against the Turks; that, as to advice, it would be too great a presumption in them to give advice to a prince who was surrounded by such experienced generals and such able ministers. Peron dei Baschi, when he found he could get no other answer, next made for Florence. Piero dei Medici received him at a grand council, for he summoned on this occasion not only the 70, but also the Gonfalonieri, who had sat for the last 34 years in the Signoria. The French ambassador put forward his proposal that the Republic should permit their army to pass through her states, and pledge herself in that case to supply for ready money all the necessary victual and fodder. The magnificent Republic replied that if Charles VIII. Had been marching against the Turks instead of against Ferdinand, she would be only too ready to grant everything he wished, but being bound to the house of Aragon by a treaty, she could not betray her ally by yielding to the demands of the King of France. End of Section 7. Section 8 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 8. The Borgias. Chapter 4, Part 2. The ambassadors next turned their steps to Siena. The poor little Republic, terrified by the honor of being considered at all, replied that it was her desire to preserve a strict neutrality, that she was too weak to declare beforehand either for or against such mighty rivals, for she would naturally be obliged to join the stronger party. Furnished with this reply, which had at least the merit of frankness, the French envoys proceeded to Rome, and were conducted into the Pope's presence, where they demanded the investiture of the kingdom of Naples for their king. Alexander VI. Replied that, as his predecessors had granted this investiture to the house of Aragon, he could not take it away unless it were first established that the house of Anjou had a better claim than the house that was to be dispossessed. Then he represented to Peron dei Baschi that, as Naples was a fief of the Holy See, to the Pope alone the choice of her sovereign properly belonged, and that, in consequence, to attack the reigning sovereign was to attack the Church itself. The result of the embassy, we see, was not very promising for Charles VIII., so he resolved to rely on his ally Ludovico Sforza alone, and to relegate all other questions to the fortunes of war. A piece of news that reached him about this time strengthened him in this resolution. This was the death of Ferdinand. The old king had caught a severe cold and cough on his return from the hunting field, and in 2 days he was at his last gasp. On the 25th of January, 1494, he passed away at the age of 70 after a 36 years' reign, leaving the throne to his elder son Alfonso, who was immediately chosen as his successor. Ferdinand never belied his title of the happy ruler. His death occurred at the very moment when the fortune of his family was changing. The new king, Alfonso, was not a novice in arms. He had already fought successfully against Florence and Venice, and had driven the Turks out of Otranto. Besides, he had the name of being as cunning as his father in the tortuous game of politics, so much in vogue at the Italian courts. He did not despair of counting among his allies the very enemy he was at war with when Charles VIII first put forward his pretensions, we mean Bajazet II. So he dispatched to Bajazet one of his confidential ministers, Camillo Pandoni, to give the Turkish emperor to understand that the expedition to Italy was to the King of France nothing but a blind for approaching the scene of Mohammedan conquests, and that if Charles VIII were once at the Adriatic, it would only take him a day or two to get across and attack Macedonia. From there he could easily go by land to Constantinople. Consequently he suggested that Bajazet, for the maintenance of their common interests, should supply 6,000 horse and 6,000 infantry. He himself would furnish their pay so long as they were in Italy. It was settled that Pandoni should be joined at Tarentum by Giorgio Bucciarda, Alexander VI envoy, who was commissioned by the Pope to engage the Turks to help him against the Christians. But while he was waiting for Bajazet's reply, which might involve a delay of several months, Alfonso requested that a meeting might take place between Piero de' Medici, the Pope, and himself, to take counsel together about important affairs. This meeting was arranged at Vicovaro, near Tivoli, and the three interested parties duly met on the appointed day. The intention of Alfonso, who before leaving Naples had settled the disposition of his naval forces, and given his brother Frederick the command of a fleet that consisted of 36 galleys, 18 large and 12 small vessels, with injunctions to wait at Livorno and keep a watch on the fleet Charles VIII was getting ready at the port of Genoa, was above all things to check, with the aid of his allies, the progress of operations on land. Without counting the contingent he expected his allies to furnish, he had at his immediate disposal 100 squadrons of heavy cavalry, 20 men in each, and 3,000 bowmen and light horse. He proposed, therefore, to advance at once into Lombardy, to get up a revolution in favor of his nephew Galeazzo, and to drive Ludovico Sforza out of Milan before he could get help from France, so that Charles VIII, at the very time of crossing the Alps, would find an enemy to fight instead of a friend who had promised him a safe passage, men, and money. This was the scheme of a great politician and a bold commander, but as everybody had come in pursuit of his own interests, regardless of the common, this plan was very coldly received by Piero dei Medici, who was afraid lest in the war he should play only the same poor part he had been threatened with in the affair of the embassy. By Alexander VI it was rejected because he reckoned on employing the troops of Alfonso on his own account. He reminded the King of Naples of one of the conditions of the investiture he had promised him, viz. that he should drive out the Cardinal Giuliano della Rovera from the town of Ostia, and give up the town to him, according to the stipulation already agreed upon. Besides, the advantages that had accrued to Virginio Orsini, Alexander's favourite, from his embassy to Naples, had brought upon him the ill will of Prospero and Fabrizio Colonna, who owned nearly all the villages round about Rome. Now the Pope could not endure to live in the midst of such powerful enemies, and the most important matter was to deliver him from all of them, seeing that it was really of moment that he should be at peace, who was the head and soul of the League, whereof the others were only the body and limbs. Although Alfonso had clearly seen through the motives of Piero's coldness, and Alexander had not even given him the trouble of seeking his, he was none the less obliged to bow to the will of his allies, leaving the one to defend the Apennines against the French, and helping the other to shake himself free of his neighbours in the Romagna. Consequently he pressed on the siege of Ostia, and added to Virginio's forces, which already amounted to 200 men of the papal army, a body of his own light horse. This little army was to be stationed round about Rome, and was to enforce obedience from the Colonnas. The rest of his troops Alfonso divided into two parties. One he left in the hands of his son Ferdinand, with orders to scour the Romagna and worry the petty princes into levying and supporting the contingent they had promised, while with the other he himself defended the defiles of Abruzzi. On the 23rd of April, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Alexander VI was freed from the first and fiercest of his foes. Giuliano della Rovera, seeing the impossibility of holding out any longer against Alfonso's troops, embarked on a brigantine which was to carry him to Savona. From that day forward Virginio Orsini began that famous partisan warfare which reduced the country about Rome to the most pathetic desolation the world has ever seen. During all this time Charles VIII. Was at Lyons, not only uncertain as to the route he ought to take for getting into Italy, but even beginning to reflect a little on the chances and risks of such an expedition. He had found no sympathy anywhere except with Ludovico Sforza, so it appeared not unlikely that he would have to fight not the kingdom of Naples alone, but the whole of Italy to boot. In his preparations for war he had spent almost all the money at his disposal. The Lady of Beaujeu and the Duke of Bourbon both condemned his enterprise. Briconnet, who had advised it, did not venture to support it now. At last Charles, more irresolute than ever, had recalled several regiments that had actually started, when Cardinal Giuliano della Rovera, driven out of Italy by the Pope, arrived at Lyons and presented himself before the king. The cardinal, full of hatred, full of hope, hastened to Charles and found him on the point of abandoning that enterprise on which, as Alexandre's enemy, della Rovera rested his whole expectation of vengeance. He informed Charles of the quarrelling among his enemies. He showed him that each of them was seeking his own ends: Piero de' Medici, the gratification of his pride; the Pope, the aggrandisement of his house. He pointed out that armed fleets were in the ports of Villefranche, Marseilles, and Genoa, and that these armaments would be lost. He reminded him that he had sent Pierre d'Urf, his grand equerry, on in advance, to have splendid accommodations prepared in the Spinola and Doria palaces. Lastly, he urged that ridicule and disgrace would fall on him from every side if he renounced an enterprise so loudly vaunted beforehand, for whose successful execution, moreover, he had been obliged to sign 3 treaties of peace that were all vexatious enough, viz., with Henry VII., with Maximilian, and with Ferdinand the Catholic. Giuliano della Rovera had exercised true insight in probing the vanity of the young king, and Charles did not hesitate for a single moment. He ordered his cousin, the Duke of Orleans, who later on became Louis XII., to take command of the French fleet and bring it to Genoa. He dispatched a courier to Antoine de Bessé, Baron de Tricastel, bidding him to take to Asti the 2,000 Swiss foot soldiers he had levied in the cantons. Lastly, he started himself from Vienne in Dauphine on the 23rd of August, 1494, crossed the Alps by Montgenèvre without encountering a single body of troops to dispute his passage, descended into Piedmont and Monferrato, both just then governed by women regents, the sovereigns of both principalities being children, Charles John Aimé and William John, aged respectively 6 and 8. The 2 regents appeared before Charles VIII., one at Turin, one at Casale, each at the head of a numerous and brilliant court, and both glittering with jewels and precious stones. Charles, although he quite well knew that for all these friendly demonstrations they were both bound by treaty to his enemy, Alfonso of Naples, treated them all the same with the greatest politeness, and when they made protestations of friendship, asked them to let him have a proof of it, suggesting they should lend him the diamonds they were covered with. The 2 regents could do no less than obey the invitation, which was really a command. They took off necklaces, rings, and earrings. Charles VII. Gave them a receipt accurately drawn up, and pledged the jewels for 20,000 ducats. Then, enriched by this money, he resumed his journey, and made his way towards Asti. The Duke of Orleans held the sovereignty of Asti, as we said before, and hither came to meet Charles both Ludovico Sforza and his father-in-law, Hercule d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. They brought with them not only the promised troops and money, but also a court composed of the loveliest women in Italy. The balls, fêtes, and tourneys began with a magnificence surpassing anything that Italy had ever seen before. but suddenly they were interrupted by the king's illness. This was the first example in Italy of the disease brought by Christopher Columbus from the New World, and was called by the Italians the French, and by Frenchmen the Italian disease. The probability is that some of Columbus's crew who were at Genoa or thereabouts had already brought over this strange and cruel complaint that counterbalanced the gains of the American gold mines. The king's indisposition, however, did not prove so grave as was at first supposed. He was cured by the end of a few weeks, and proceeded on his way towards Pavia, where the young Duke John Galeazzo lay dying. He and the King of France were first cousins, sons of two sisters of the House of Savoy, so Charles VIII. Was obliged to see him, and went to visit him in the castle where he lived more like prisoner than lord. He found him half reclining on a couch, pale and emaciated, some said in consequence of luxurious living, others from the effects of a slow but deadly poison. But whether or not the poor young man was desirous of pouring out a complaint to Charles, he did not dare say a word, for his uncle, Ludovico Sforza, never left the King of France for an instant. But at the very moment when Charles VIII. Was getting up to go, the door opened, and a young woman appeared and threw herself at the king's feet. She was the wife of the unlucky John Galeazzo, and came to entreat his cousin to do nothing against her father Alfonso, nor against her brother Ferdinand. At sight of her, Sforza scowled with an anxious and threatening aspect, for he knew not what impression might be produced on his ally by this scene. But he was soon reassured, for Charles replied that he had advanced too far to draw back now, and that the glory of his name was at stake, as well as the interests of his kingdom, and that these two motives were far too important to be sacrificed to any sentiment of pity he might feel, however real and deep it might be and was. The poor young woman, who had based her last hope on this appeal, then rose from her knees and threw herself sobbing into her husband's arms. Charles VIII. And Ludovico Sforza took their leave. John Galeazzo was doomed. 2 days after, Charles VIII. Left for Florence, accompanied by his ally. But scarcely had they reached Parma when a messenger caught them up and announced to Ludovico that his nephew was just dead. Ludovico at once begged Charles to excuse his leaving him to finish the journey alone. The interests which called him back to Milan were so important, he said, that he could not, under the circumstances, stay away a single day longer. As a fact, he had to make sure of succeeding the man he had assassinated. But Charles VIII. Continued his road not without some uneasiness. The sight of the young prince on his deathbed had moved him deeply, for at the bottom of his heart he was convinced that Ludovico Sforza was his murderer, and a murderer might very well be a traitor. He was going forward into an unfamiliar country, with a declared enemy in front of him and a doubtful friend behind. He was now at the entrance to the mountains, and as his army had no store of provisions, and only lived from hand to mouth, a forced delay, however short, would mean famine. In front of him was Fivizzano, nothing, it is true, but a village surrounded by walls, but beyond Fivizzano lay Sarzano and Pietrasanta, both of them considered impregnable fortresses. Worse than this, they were coming into a part of the country that was especially unhealthy in October, had no natural product except oil, and even procured its own corn from neighboring provinces. It was plain that a whole army might perish there in a few days, either from scarcity of food or from the unwholesome air, both of which were more disastrous than the impediments offered at every step by the nature of the ground. The situation was grave, but the pride of Piero de' Medici came once more to the rescue of the fortunes of Charles VIII. End of section 8. Section 9 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 9. The Borgias. Chapter 5, Part 1. Piero dei Medici had, as we may remember, undertaken to hold the entrance to Tuscany against the French. When, however, he saw his enemy coming down from the Alps, he felt less confident about his own strength, and demanded help from the Pope. But scarcely had the rumor of foreign invasion begun to spread in the Romagna, than the Colonna family declared themselves the French king's men, and collecting all their forces, seized Ostia, and there awaited the coming of the French fleet to offer a passage through Rome. The Pope, therefore, instead of sending troops to Florence, was obliged to recall all his soldiers to be near the capital. The only promise he made to Piero was that if Bajazet should send him the troops that he had been asking for, he would dispatch that army for him to make use of. Piero dei Medici had not yet taken any resolution or formed any plan, when he suddenly heard two startling pieces of news. A jealous neighbor of his, the Marquis of Torderiovo, had betrayed to the French the weak side of Fivizzano, so that they had taken it by storm, and had put its soldiers and inhabitants to the edge of the sword. On another side, Gilbert of Montpensier, who had been lighting up the sea-coast so as to keep open the communications between the French army and their fleet, had met with a detachment sent by Paolo Orsini to Sarzano to reinforce the garrison there, and after an hour's fighting had cut it to pieces. No quarter had been granted to any of the prisoners. Every man the French could get hold of they had massacred. This was the first occasion on which the Italians, accustomed as they were to the chivalrous contests of the 15th century, found themselves in contact with savage foreigners who, less advanced in civilization, had not yet come to consider war as a clever game, but looked upon it as simply a mortal conflict. So the news of these two butcheries produced a tremendous sensation at Florence, the richest city in Italy, and the most prosperous in commerce and in art. Every Florentine imagined the French to be like an army of those ancient barbarians who were wont to extinguish fire with blood. The prophecies of Savonarola, who had predicted the foreign invasion and the destruction that should follow it, were recalled to the minds of all, and so much perturbation was evinced that Piero dei Medici, bent on getting peace at any price, forced a decree upon the Republic whereby she was to send an embassy to the conqueror, and obtained leave, resolved as he was to deliver himself in person into the hands of the French monarch, to act as one of the ambassadors. He accordingly quitted Florence, accompanied by 4 other messengers, and on his arrival at Pietrasanta sent to ask from Charles VIII a safe conduct for himself alone. The day after he made this request, Brigonnet and de Piennes came to fetch him, and led him into the presence of Charles VIII. Piero dei Medici, in spite of his name and influence, was, in the eyes of the French nobility, who considered it a dishonorable thing to concern oneself with art or industry, nothing more than a rich merchant, with whom it would be absurd to stand upon any very strict ceremony. So Charles VIII received him on horseback, and addressing him with a haughty air, as a master might address a servant, demanded whence came this pride of his that made him dispute his entrance into Tuscany. Piero dei Medici replied that, with the actual consent of Louis XI, his father Lorenzo had concluded a treaty of alliance with Ferdinand of Naples, that accordingly he had acted in obedience to prior obligations, but as he did not wish to push too far his devotion to the House of Aragon or his opposition to France, he was ready to do whatever Charles VIII might demand of him. The king, who had never looked for such humility in his enemy, demanded that Sarzano should be given up to him. To this Piero dei Medici at once consented. Then the conqueror, wishing to see how far the ambassador of the magnificent Republic would extend his politeness, replied that this concession was far from satisfying him, and that he still must have the keys of Pietrasanta, Pisa, Librafata, and Livorno. Piero saw no more difficulty about these than about Sarzano, and consented, on Charles's mere promise by word of mouth to restore the town when he had achieved the conquest of Naples. At last Charles VIII, seeing that this man who had been sent out to negotiate with him was very easy to manage, exacted as a final condition, a sine qua non, however, of his royal protection, that the magnificent Republic should lend him the sum of 200,000 florins. Piero found it no harder to dispose of money than of fortresses, and replied that his fellow citizens would be happy to render this service to their new ally. Then Charles VIII set him on horseback, and ordered him to go on in front, so as to begin to carry out his promises by yielding up the 4 fortresses he had insisted on having. Piero obeyed, and the French army, led by the grandson of Cosimo the Great and the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, continued its triumphal march through Tuscany. On his arrival at Lucca, Piero de' Medici learnt that his concessions to the King of France were making a terrible commotion at Florence. The magnificent Republic had supposed that what Charles VIII wanted was simply a passage through her territory, so when the news came, there was a general feeling of discontent, which was augmented by the return of the other ambassadors, whom Piero had not even consulted when he took action as he did. Piero considered it necessary that he should return, so he asked Charles's permission to precede him to the capital. As he had fulfilled all his promises, except the matter of the loan, which could not be settled anywhere but at Florence, the king saw no objection, and the very evening after he quitted the French army, Piero returned incognito to his palace in the Via Largo. The next day he proposed to present himself before the Signoria, but when he arrived at the piazza del Palazzo Vecchio, he perceived the Gonfaloniere Jacopo de Nerli coming towards him, signalling him that it was useless to attempt to go farther, and pointing out to him the figure of Luca Corsini standing at the gate, sword in hand. Behind him stood guards, ordered, if need were, to dispute his passage. Piero de' Medici, amazed by an opposition that he was experiencing for the first time in his life, did not attempt resistance. He went home and wrote to his brother-in-law, Paolo Orsini, to come and help him with his gendarmes. Unluckily for him, his letter was intercepted. The Signoria considered that it was an attempt at rebellion. They summoned the citizens to their aid. They armed hastily, sallied forth in crowds, and thronged about the piazza of the palace. Meanwhile Cardinal John de' Medici had mounted on horseback, and under the impression that the Orsini were coming to the rescue, was riding about the streets of Florence accompanied by his servants and uttering his battle cry, "Palle, palle!" But times had changed. There was no echo to the cry, and when the cardinal reached the Via dei Collezioli, a threatening murmur was the only response, and he understood that instead of trying to arouse Florence, he had much better get away before the excitement ran too high. He promptly retired to his own palace, expecting to find there his 2 brothers, Piero and Giuliano. But they, under the protection of Orsini and his gendarmes, had made their escape by the Porto San Gallo. The peril was imminent, and John de' Medici wished to follow their example, but wherever he went he was met by a clamour that grew more and more threatening. At last, as he saw that the danger was constantly increasing, he dismounted from his horse and ran into a house that he found standing open. This house by a lucky chance communicated with a convent of Franciscans. One of the friars lent the fugitive his dress, and the cardinal, under the protection of this humble incognito, contrived at last to get outside Florence, and joined his 2 brothers in the Apennines. The same day the Medici were declared traitors and rebels, and ambassadors were sent to the King of France. They found him at Pisa, where he was granting independence to the town, which 87 years ago had fallen under the rule of the Florentines. Charles VIII made no reply to the envoys, but merely announced that he was going to march on Florence. Such a reply, one may easily understand, terrified the Republic. Florence had no time to prepare a defence, and no strength in her present state to make one. But all the powerful houses assembled and armed their own servants and retainers, and awaited the issue, intending not to begin hostilities, but to defend themselves should the French make an attack. It was agreed that if any necessity should arise for taking up arms, the bells of the various churches in the town should ring a peal, and so serve as a general signal. Such a resolution was perhaps of more significant moment in Florence than it could have been in any other town, for the palaces that still remain from that period are virtually fortresses, and the eternal fights between Guelphs and Ghibellines had familiarized the Tuscan people with street warfare. The king appeared on the 17th of November in the evening at the gate of San Friano. He found there the nobles of Florence clad in their most magnificent apparel, accompanied by priests chanting hymns, and by a mob who were full of joy at any prospect of change, and hoped for a return of liberty after the fall of the Medici. Charles VIII. Stopped for a moment under a sort of gilded canopy that had been prepared for him, and replied in a few evasive words to the welcoming speeches which were addressed to him by the Signoria. Then he asked for his lance. He set it in rest, and gave the order to enter the town, the whole of which he paraded with his army following him with arms erect, and then went down to the palace of the Medici, which had been prepared for him. The next day negotiations commenced, but everyone was out of his reckoning. The Florentines had received Charles VIII. As a guest, but he had entered the city as a conqueror. So when the deputies of the Signoria spoke of ratifying the treaty of Piero de' Medici, the king replied that such a treaty no longer existed, as they had banished the man who made it; that he had conquered Florence, as he proved the night before when he entered lance in hand; that he should retain the sovereignty, and would make any further decision whenever it pleased him to do so. Further, he would let them know later on whether he would reinstate the Medici, or whether he would delegate his authority to the Signoria. All they had to do was to come back the next day, and he would give them his ultimatum in writing. This reply threw Florence into a great state of consternation, but the Florentines were confirmed in their resolution of making a stand. Charles, for his part, had been astonished by the great number of the inhabitants. Not only was every street he had passed through thickly lined with people, but every house from garret to basement seemed overflowing with human beings. Florence, indeed, thanks to her rapid increase in population, could muster nearly 150,000 souls. The next day, at the appointed hour, the deputies made their appearance to meet the king. They were again introduced into his presence, and the discussion was reopened. At last, as they were coming to no sort of understanding, the royal secretary, standing at the foot of the throne upon which Charles VIII. Sat with covered head, unfolded a paper and began to read, article by article, the conditions imposed by the King of France. But scarcely had he read a third of the document when the discussion began more hotly than ever before. Then Charles VIII. Said that thus it should be, or he would order his trumpets to be sounded. Hereupon Piero Capponi, secretary to the Republic, commonly called the Scipio of Florence, snatched from the royal secretary's hand the shameful proposal of capitulation, and tearing it to pieces, exclaimed, "Very good, sire, blow your trumpets, and we will ring our bells." He threw the pieces in the face of the amazed reader, and dashed out of the room to give the terrible order that would convert the streets of Florence into a battlefield. Still, against all probabilities, this bold answer saved the town. The French supposed, from such audacious words, addressed as they were to men who so far had encountered no single obstacle, that the Florentines were possessed of sure resources, to them unknown. The few prudent men who retained any influence over the king advised him accordingly to abate his pretensions. The result was that Charles VIII. Offered new and more reasonable conditions, which were accepted, signed by both parties, and proclaimed on the 26th of November during Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. These were the conditions: The Signoria were to pay to Charles VIII as subsidy the sum of 120,000 florins in 3 installments. The Signoria were to remove the sequestration imposed upon the property of the Medici, and to recall the decree that set a price on their heads. The Signoria were to engage to pardon the Pisans on condition of their again submitting to the rule of Florence. Lastly, the Signoria were to recognize the claims of the Duke of Milan over Sarzano and Pietrasanta, and these claims thus recognized were to be settled by arbitration. In exchange for this, the King of France pledged himself to restore the fortresses that had been given up to him, either after he had made himself master of the town of Naples, or when this war should be ended by a peace or a 2 years' truce, or else when, for any reason whatsoever, he should have quitted Italy. 2 days after this proclamation, Charles VIII, much to the joy of the Signoria, left Florence and advanced towards Rome by the route of Poggibonsi and Siena. The Pope began to be affected by the general terror. He had heard of the massacres of Fivizzano, of Lungiani, and of Imola. He knew that Piero dei Medici had handed over the Tuscan fortresses, that Florence had succumbed, and that Catherine Sforza had made terms with the conqueror. He saw the broken remnants of the Neapolitan troops pass disheartened through Rome, to rally their strength in the Abruzzi, and thus he found himself exposed to an enemy who was advancing upon him with the whole of the Romagna under his control, from one sea to the other, in a line of march extending from Piombina to Ancona. It was at this juncture that Alexander VI received his answer from Bajazet II. The reason of so long a delay was that the Pope's envoy and the Neapolitan ambassador had been stopped by John della Rovera, the Cardinal Giuliano's brother, just as they were disembarking at Sinigalia. They were charged with a verbal answer, which was that the Sultan at this moment was busied with a triple war, first with the Sultan of Egypt, secondly with the King of Hungary, and thirdly with the Greeks of Macedonia and Epirus, and therefore he could not, with all the will in the world, help his Holiness with armed men. But the envoys were accompanied by a favourite of the Sultan's, bearing a private letter to Alexander VI, in which Bajazet offered on certain conditions to help him with money. Although, as we see, the messengers had been stopped on the way, the Turkish envoy had all the same found a means of getting his despatch sent to the Pope. We give it here in all its naivete. Quote, Bajazet the Sultan, son of the Sultan Mahomet II, by the grace of God, Emperor of Asia and Europe, to the Father and Lord of all the Christians, Alexander VI, Roman Pontiff and Pope by the will of heavenly providence. First, greetings that we owe him and bestow with all our heart. We make known to your Highness by the envoy of your Mightiness, Giorgio Bucciarda, that we have been apprised of your convalescence, and received the news thereof with great joy and comfort. Among other matters, the said Bucciarda has brought us word that the King of France, now marching against your Highness, has shown a desire to take under his protection our brother de Gem, who is now under yours, a thing which is not only against our will, but which would also be the cause of great injury to your Highness and to all Christendom. In turning the matter over with your envoy Giorgio, we have devised a scheme most conducive to peace, and most advantageous and honourable to your Highness, at the same time satisfactory to ourselves personally. It would be well if our aforesaid brother de Gem, who, being a man, is liable to death, and who is now in the hands of your Highness, should quit this world as soon as possible, seeing that his departure, a real good to him in his position, would be of great use to your Highness, and very conducive to your peace, while at the same time it would be very agreeable to us, your friend. If this proposition is favourably received, as we hope, by your Highness, in your desire to be friendly towards us, it would be advisable, both in the interests of your Highness and for our own satisfaction, that it should occur rather sooner than later, and by the surest means that you might be pleased to employ, so that our said brother Degem might pass from the pains of this world into a better and more peaceful life, where at last he may find repose. If your Highness should adopt this plan and send us the body of our brother, we, the above-named Sultan Bajazet, pledge ourselves to send to your Highness, wheresoever and by whatsoever hands you please, the sum of 300,000 ducats, with which sum you could purchase some fair domain for your children. In order to facilitate this purchase, we would be willing, while awaiting the issue, to place the 300,000 ducats in the hands of a third party, so that your Highness might be quite certain of receiving the money on an appointed day, in return for the despatch of our brother's body. Moreover, we promise your Highness herewith, for your greater satisfaction, that never, so long as you shall remain on the pontifical throne, shall there be any hurt done to the Christians, neither by us, nor by our servants, nor by any of our compatriots, of whatsoever kind or condition they may be, neither on sea nor on land. And for the still further satisfaction of your Highness, and in order that no doubt whatever may remain concerning the fulfillment of our promises, we have sworn and affirmed in the presence of Bucciarda, your envoy, by the true God whom we adore, and by our holy Gospels, that they shall be faithfully kept from the first point unto the last. And now for the final and complete assurance of your Highness, in order that no doubt may still remain in your heart, and that you may be once again and profoundly convinced of our good faith, we, the aforesaid Sultan Bajazet, do swear by the true God, who has created the heavens and the earth and all that therein is, that we will religiously observe all that has been above said and declared, and in the future will do nothing and undertake nothing that may be contrary to the interests of your Highness. Given at Constantinople in our palace on the 12th of September A.D. 1494. End of section 9. Section 10 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 10. The Borgias. Chapter 5, Part 2. This letter was a cause of great joy to the Holy Father. The aid of 4,000 or 5,000 Turks would be insufficient under the present circumstances, and would only serve to compromise the head of Christendom, while the sum of 300,000 ducats, that is, nearly 1,000,000 francs, was good to get in any sort of circumstances. It is true that, so long as Degem lived, Alexander was drawing an income of 180,000 livres, which as a life annuity represented a capital of nearly 2 millions. But when one needs ready money, one ought to be able to make a sacrifice in the way of discount. All the same, Alexander formed no definite plan, resolved on acting as circumstances should indicate. But it was a more pressing business to decide how he should behave to the King of France. He had never anticipated the success of the French in Italy, and we have seen that he laid all the foundations of his family's future grandeur upon his alliance with the House of Aragon. But here was this house tottering, and a volcano more terrible than her own Vesuvius was threatening to swallow up Naples. He must therefore change his policy, and attach himself to the victor. No easy matter, for Charles VIII was bitterly annoyed with the Pope for having refused him the investiture and given it to Aragon. In consequence, he sent Cardinal Francesco Piccolomini as an envoy to the king. This choice looked like a mistake at first, seeing that the ambassador was a nephew of Pius II, who had vigorously opposed the House of Anjou. But Alexander, in acting thus, had a second design, which could not be discerned by those around him. In fact, he had divined that Charles would not be quick to receive his envoy, and that, in the parleyings to which his unwillingness must give rise, Piccolomini would necessarily be brought into contact with the young king's advisers. Now, besides his ostensible mission to the king, Piccolomini had also secret instructions for the more influential among his counselors. These were Briconnet and Philippe de Luxembourg, and Piccolomini was authorized to promise a cardinal's hat to each of them. The result was just what Alexander had foreseen. His envoy could not gain admission to Charles, and was obliged to confer with the people about him. This was what the Pope wished. Piccolomini returned to Rome with the king's refusal, but with a promise from Briconnet and Philippe de Luxembourg that they would use all their influence with Charles in favor of the Holy Father, and prepare him to receive a fresh embassy. But the French all this time were advancing, and never stopped more than 48 hours in any town, so that it became more and more urgent to get something settled with Charles. The king had entered Siena and Viterbo without striking a blow. Yves d'Allegre and Louis de Ligny had taken over Ostia from the hands of the Colonnas. Civita Vecchia and Coneto had opened their gates. The Orsini had submitted. Even John Sforza, the Pope's son-in-law, had retired from the alliance with Aragon. Alexander accordingly judged that the moment had come to abandon his ally, and sent to Charles the bishops of Concordia and Terni, and his confessor, Monsignore Graziano. They were charged to renew Briconnet and Philippe de Luxembourg the promise of the cardinalship, and had full powers of negotiation in the name of their master, both in case Charles should wish to include Alfonso II in the treaty, and in case he should refuse to sign an agreement with any other but the Pope alone. They found the mind of Charles influenced now by the insinuation of Giuliano della Rovera, who, himself a witness of the Pope's simony, pressed the king to summon a council and depose the head of the Church, and now by the secret support given him by the bishops of Mans and San Malo. The end of it was that the king decided to form his own opinion about the matter and settle nothing beforehand, and continued his route, sending the ambassadors back to the Pope with the addition of the Maréchal de Guise, the Sénéchal de Beaucaire, and Jean de Ganay, the first president of the Paris Parliament. They were ordered to say to the Pope, 1. That the king wished above all things to be admitted into Rome without resistance, that on condition of a voluntary, frank, and loyal admission, he would respect the authority of the Holy Father and the privileges of the Church. 2. That the king desired that de Gesmes should be given up to him, in order that he might make use of him against the Sultan, when he should carry the war into Macedonia or Turkey or the Holy Land. 3. That the remaining conditions were so unimportant that they could be brought forward at the first conference. The ambassadors added that the French army was now only 2 days distant from Rome, and that in the evening of the day after next, Charles would probably arrive in person to demand an answer from His Holiness. It was useless to think of parleying with a prince who acted in such expeditious fashion as this. Alexander accordingly warned Ferdinand to quit Rome as soon as possible in the interests of his own personal safety. But Ferdinand refused to listen to a word, and declared that he would not go out at one gate while Charles VIII came in at another. His sojourn was not long. 2 days later, about 11 o'clock in the morning, a sentinel placed on a watch-tower at the top of the Castel Sant'Angelo, whither the Pope had retired, cried out that the vanguard of the enemy was visible on the horizon. At once Alexander and the Duke of Calabria went up on the terrace which tops the fortress, and assured themselves with their own eyes that what the soldier said was true. Then, and not till then, did the Duke of Calabria mount on horseback, and, to use his own words, went out at the gate of San Sebastiana, at the same moment that the French vanguard halted 500 feet from the gate of the people. This was on the 31st of December, 1494. At 3 in the afternoon the whole army had arrived, and the vanguard began their march, drums beating, ensigns unfurled. It was composed, says Paolo Giove, an eye-witness, Book 2, page 41 of his History, of Swiss and German soldiers, with short, tight coats of various colors. They were armed with short swords, with steel edges like those of the ancient Romans, and carried ashen lances 10 feet long, with straight and sharp iron spikes. Only 1/4 of their number bore halberts instead of lances, the spikes cut into the form of an axe and surmounted on a 4-cornered spike, to be used both for cutting like an axe and piercing like a bayonet. The first row of each battalion wore helmets and cuirasses which protected the head and chest, and when the men were drawn up for battle they presented to the enemy a triple array of iron spikes, which they could raise or lower like the spines of a porcupine. To each 1,000 of the soldiery were attached 100 fusiliers. Their officers, to distinguish them from the men, wore lofty plumes on their helmets. After the Swiss came the archers of Gascony. There were 5,000 of them, wearing a very simple dress that contrasted with the rich costume of the Swiss soldiers, the shortest of whom would have been a head higher than the tallest of the Gascons. But they were excellent soldiers, full of courage, very light, and with a special reputation for quickness in stringing and drawing their iron bows. Behind them rode the cavalry, the flower of the French nobility, with their gilded helmets and neckbands, their velvet and silk surcoats, their swords, each of which had its own name, their shields, each telling of territorial estates, and their colors, each telling of a lady-love. Besides defensive arms, each man bore a lance in his hand, like an Italian gendarme, with a solid grooved end, and on his saddle-bow a quantity of weapons, some for cutting and some for thrusting. Their horses were large and strong, but they had their tails and ears cropped according to the French custom. These horses, unlike those of the Italian gendarmes, wore no caparisons of dressed leather, which made them more exposed to attack. Every knight was followed by 3 horses, the first ridden by a page in armor like his own, the 2 others by equerries, who were called lateral auxiliaries, because in a fray they fought to right and left of their chief. This troop was not only the most magnificent, but the most considerable in the whole army, for as there were 2,500 knights, they formed each with their 3 followers a total of 10,000 men. 5,000 light horse rode next, who carried huge wooden bows and shot long arrows from a distance like English archers. They were a great help in battle, for moving rapidly wherever aid was required, they could fly in a moment from one wing to another, from the rear to the van, then when their quivers were empty could go off at so swift a gallop that neither infantry nor heavy cavalry could pursue them. Their defensive armor consisted of a helmet and half cuirass. Some of them carried a short lance as well, with which to pin their stricken foe to the ground. They all wore long cloaks adorned with shoulder knots, and plates of silver whereon the arms of their chief were emblazoned. At last came the young king's escort. There were 400 archers, among whom 100 Scots formed a line on each side, while 200 of the most illustrious knights marched on foot beside the prince, carrying heavy arms on their shoulders. In the midst of this magnificent escort advanced Charles VIII, both he and his horse covered with splendid armor. On his right and left marched Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, the Duke of Milan's brother, and Cardinal Giuliano della Rovera, of whom we have spoken so often, who was afterwards Pope Julius II. The Cardinals Colonna and Savelli followed immediately after, and behind them came Prospero and Fabrizio Colonna, and all the Italian princes and generals who had thrown in their lot with the conquerors, and were marching intermingled with the great French lords. For a long time the crowd that had collected to see all these foreign soldiers go by, a sight so new and strange, listened uneasily to a dull sound which got nearer and nearer. The earth visibly trembled, the glass shook in the windows, and behind the king's escort 36 bronze cannon were seen to advance, bumping along as they lay on their gun carriages. These cannons were 8 feet in length, and as their mouths were large enough to hold a man's head, it was supposed that each of these terrible machines, scarcely known as yet to the Italians, weighed nearly 6,000 pounds. After the cannons came culverins 16 feet long, and then falconets, the smallest of which shot balls the size of a grenade. This formidable artillery brought up the rear of the procession and formed the hindmost guard of the French army. It was 6 hours since the front guard entered the town, and as it was now night, and for every 6 artillerymen there was a torch-bearer, this illumination gave to the objects around a more gloomy character than they would have shown in the sunlight. The young king was to take up his quarters in the Palazzo di Venezia, and all the artillery was directed towards the plaza and the neighbouring streets. The remainder of the army was dispersed about the town. The same evening they brought to the king, less to do honour to him than to assure him of his safety, the keys of Rome and the keys of the Belvedere Garden. Just the same thing had been done for the Duke of Calabria. The Pope, as we said, had retired to the Castel Sant'Angelo with only 6 cardinals, so from the day after his arrival the young king had around him a court of very different brilliance from that of the head of the church. Then arose anew the question of a convocation to prove Alexander's simony and proceed to depose him. But the king's chief counsellors, gained over, as we know, pointed out that this was a bad moment to excite a new schism in the church, just when preparations were being made for war against the infidels. As this was also the king's private opinion, there was not much trouble in persuading him, and he made up his mind to treat with his holiness. But the negotiations had scarcely begun when they had to be broken off, for the first thing Charles VIII demanded was the surrender of the Castel Sant'Angelo, and as the Pope saw in this castle his only refuge, it was the last thing he chose to give up. Twice, in his youthful impatience, Charles wanted to take by force what he could not get by good will, and had his cannons directed towards the Holy Father's dwelling-place. But the Pope was unmoved by these demonstrations, and obstinate as he was, this time it was the French king who gave way. This article, therefore, was set aside, and the following conditions were agreed upon: that there should be from this day forward between His Majesty the King of France and the Holy Father a sincere friendship and a firm alliance. Before the completion of the conquest of the kingdom of Naples, the King of France should occupy, for the advantage and accommodation of his army, the fortresses of Civita Vecchia, Terracina, and Spoleto. Lastly, the Cardinal Valentino, this was now the name of Cesar Borgia after his archbishopric of Valencia, should accompany the king in the capacity of apostolic ambassador, really as a hostage. These conditions fixed, the ceremonial of an interview was arranged. The king left the Palazzo di Venezia and went to live in the Vatican. At the appointed time he entered by the door of a garden that adjoined the palace, while the Pope, who had not had to quit the Castel Sant'Angelo thanks to a corridor communicating between the two palaces, came down into the same garden by another gate. The result of this arrangement was that the king the next moment perceived the Pope and knelt down, but the Pope pretended not to see him, and the king, advancing a few paces, knelt a second time. As his holiness was at that moment screened by some masonry, this supplied him with another excuse, and the king went on with the performance, got up again, once more advanced several steps, and was on the point of kneeling down the third time face to face, when the Holy Father at last perceived him, and, walking towards him as though he would prevent him from kneeling, took off his own hat, and pressing him to his heart, raised him up and tenderly kissed his forehead, refusing to cover until the king had put his cap upon his head, with the aid of the Pope's own hands. Then, after they had stood for a moment exchanging polite and friendly speeches, the king lost no time in praying his holiness to be so good as to receive into the sacred college William Briconnet, the Bishop of St. Malo. As this matter had been agreed upon beforehand by that prelate and his holiness, though the king was not aware of it, Alexander was pleased to get credit by promptly granting the request, and he instantly ordered one of his attendants to go to the house of his son, Cardinal Valentino, and fetch a cape and hat. Then, taking the king by the hand, he conducted him into the hall of Papagalli, where the ceremony was to take place of the admission of the new cardinal. The solemn oath of obedience which was to be taken by Charles to his Holiness as supreme head of the Christian Church was postponed till the following day. When that solemn day arrived, every person important in Rome, noble, cleric, or soldier, assembled around his Holiness. Charles, on his side, made his approach to the Vatican with a splendid following of princes, prelates, and captains. At the threshold of the palace he found 4 cardinals who had arrived before him. 2 of them placed themselves one on each side of him, the 2 others behind him, and all his retinue following. They traversed a long line of apartments full of guards and servants, and at last arrived in the reception room, where the Pope was seated on his throne with his son Cesar Borgia behind him. On his arrival at the door, the King of France began the usual ceremonial, and when he had gone on from genuflections to kissing the feet, the hand, and the forehead, he stood up while the first President of the Parliament of Paris, in his turn stepping forward, said in a loud voice, "Very Holy Father, behold my King ready to offer to your Holiness that oath of obedience that he owes to you. But in France it is customary that he who offers himself as vassal to his lord shall receive in exchange therefor such boons as he may demand. His Majesty, therefore, while he pledges himself for his own part to behave unto your Holiness with a munificence even greater than that wherewith your Holiness shall behave unto him, is here to beg urgently that you accord him 3 favours. These favours are, first, the confirmation of privileges already granted to the king, to the queen his wife, and to the Dauphin his son. Secondly, the investiture for himself and his successors of the kingdom of Naples. Lastly, the surrender to him of the person of the Sultan Djem, brother of the Turkish emperor." At this address the Pope was for a moment stupefied, for he did not expect these 3 demands, which were moreover made so publicly by Charles that no manner of refusal was possible. But quickly recovering his presence of mind, he replied to the king that he would willingly confirm the privileges that had been accorded to the House of France by his predecessors, that he might therefore consider his first demand granted; that the investiture of the kingdom was an affair that required deliberation in a council of cardinals, but he would do all he possibly could to induce them to accede to the king's desire. Lastly, he must defer the affair of the Sultan's brother till a time more opportune for discussing it with the Sacred College, but would venture to say that, as this surrender could not fail to be for the good of Christendom, as it was demanded for the purpose of assuring further the success of a crusade, it would not be his fault if on this point also the king should not be satisfied. At this reply Charles bowed his head in sign of satisfaction, and the first president stood up, uncovered, and resumed his discourse as follows: "Very Holy Father, it is an ancient custom among Christian kings, especially the most Christian kings of France, to signify through their ambassadors the respect they feel for the Holy See and the sovereign pontiffs whom divine providence places thereon. But the most Christian king, having felt a desire to visit the tombs of the holy apostles, has been pleased to pay this religious debt, which he regards as a sacred duty, not by ambassadors or by delegates, but in his own person. This is why, very Holy Father, His Majesty the King of France is here to acknowledge you as the true vicar of Christ, the legitimate successor of the apostles St. Peter and St. Paul, and with promise and vow renders you that filial and respectful devotion which the kings his predecessors have been accustomed to promise and vow, devoting himself and all his strength to the service of your Holiness and the interests of the Holy See." End of section 10. Section 11 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 11. The Borgias. Chapter 5, Part 3. The Pope arose with a joyful heart, for this oath, so publicly made, removed all his fears about a council. So, inclined from this moment to yield to the King of France anything he might choose to ask, he took him by his left hand and made him a short and friendly reply, dubbing him the Church's eldest son. The ceremony over, they left the hall, the Pope always holding the King's hand in his, and in this way they walked as far as the room where the sacred vestments are put off. The Pope feigned a wish to conduct the King to his own apartments, but the King would not suffer this, and, embracing once more, they separated, each to retire to his own domicile. The King remained 8 days longer at the Vatican, then returned to the Palazzo San Marco. During these 8 days all his demands were debated and settled to his satisfaction. The Bishop of Mons was made cardinal. The investiture of the kingdom of Naples was promised to the conqueror. Lastly, it was agreed that on his departure the King of France should receive from the Pope's hand the brother of the Emperor of Constantinople for a sum of 120,000 livres. But the Pope, desiring to extend to the utmost the hospitality he had been bestowing, invited de Gesmes to dinner on the very day that he was to leave Rome with his new protector. When the moment of departure arrived, Charles mounted his horse in full armor, and with a numerous and brilliant following made his way to the Vatican. Arrived at the door, he dismounted, and leaving his escort at the Piazza of St. Peter, went up with a few gentlemen only. He found His Holiness waiting for him, with Cardinal Valentino on his right, and on his left de Gesmes, who, as we said before, was dining with him, and round the table 13 cardinals. The King at once, bending on his knee, demanded the Pope's benediction, and stooped to kiss his feet. But this Alexander would not suffer. He took him in his arms, and with the lips of a father and heart of an enemy, kissed him tenderly on his forehead. Then the Pope introduced the son of Mahomet II, who was a fine young man with something noble and regal in his air, presenting in his magnificent Oriental costume a great contrast in its fashion and amplitude to the narrow, severe cut of the Christian apparel. De Gesmes advanced to Charles without humility and without pride, and, like an emperor's son treating with a king, kissed his hand and then his shoulder, and then, turning towards the Holy Father, he said in Italian, which he spoke very well, that he entreated he would recommend him to the young king, who was prepared to take him under his protection, assuring the pontiff that he should never have to repent giving him his liberty, and telling Charles that he hoped he might some day be proud of him if, after taking Naples, he carried out his intention of going on to Greece. These words were spoken with so much dignity, and at the same time with such gentleness, that the King of France loyally and frankly grasped the young Sultan's hand, as though he were his companion in arms. Then Charles took a final farewell of the Pope, and went down to the piazza. There he awaited Cardinal Valentino, who was about to accompany him, as we know, as a hostage, and who had remained behind to exchange a few words with his father. In a moment Cesar Borgia appeared, riding on a splendidly harnessed mule, and behind him were led 6 magnificent horses, a present from the Holy Father to the King of France. Charles at once mounted one of these, to do honor to the gift the Pope had just conferred on him, and, leaving Rome with the rest of his troops, pursued his way towards Marino, where he arrived the same evening. He learned there that Alfonso, belying his reputation as a clever politician and great general, had just embarked with all his treasures in a flotilla of 4 galleys, leaving the care of the war and the management of his kingdom to his son Ferdinand. Thus everything went well for the triumphant march of Charles. The gates of towns opened of themselves at his approach. His enemies fled without waiting for his coming, and before he had fought a single battle he had won for himself the surname of Conqueror. The day after, at dawn, the army started once more, and after marching the whole day, stopped in the evening at Velletri. There the king, who had been on horseback since the morning with Cardinal Valentino and de Gesmes, left the former at his lodging, and taking de Gesmes with him, went on to his own. Then César Borgia, who among the army baggage had 20 very heavy wagons of his own, had one of these opened, took out a splendid cabinet with the silver necessary for his table, and gave orders for his supper to be prepared as he had done the night before. Meanwhile night had come on, and he shut himself up in a private chamber, where, stripping off his cardinal's costume, he put on a groom's dress. Thanks to this disguise, he issued from the house that had been assigned for his accommodation without being recognized, traversed the streets, passed through the gates, and gained the open country. Nearly half a league outside the town a servant awaited him with 2 swift horses. César, who was an excellent rider, sprang to the saddle, and he and his companion at full gallop retraced the road to Rome, where they arrived at break of day. César got down at the house of one Flores, auditor of the Rota, where he procured a fresh horse and suitable clothes. Then he flew at once to his mother, who gave a cry of joy when she saw him, for so silent and mysterious was the cardinal for all the world beside, and even for her, that he had not said a word of his early return to Rome. The cry of joy uttered by Rosa Venozza when she beheld her son was far more a cry of vengeance than of love. One evening, while everybody was at the rejoicings in the Vatican, when Charles VIII and Alexandre VI were swearing a friendship which neither of them felt, and exchanging oaths that were broken beforehand, a messenger from Rosa Venozza had arrived with a letter to César, in which she begged him to come at once to her house in the Via della Longara. César questioned the messenger, but he only replied that he could tell him nothing, that he would learn all he cared to know from his mother's own lips. So, as soon as he was at liberty, César, in layman's dress, and wrapped in a large cloak, quitted the Vatican and made his way towards the church of Regina Coeli, in the neighbourhood of which, it will be remembered, was the house where the Pope's mistress lived. As he approached his mother's house, César began to observe the signs of strange devastation. The street was scattered with the wreck of furniture and strips of precious stuffs. As he arrived at the foot of the little flight of steps that led to the entrance gate, he saw that the windows were broken and the remains of torn curtains were fluttering in front of them. Not understanding what this disorder could mean, he rushed into the house and through several deserted and wrecked apartments. At last, seeing light in one of the rooms, he went in, and there he found his mother sitting on the remains of a chest made of ebony all inlaid with ivory and silver. When she saw César she rose, pale and dishevelled, and pointing to the desolation around her, exclaimed, "Look, César, behold the work of your new friends." "But what does it mean, mother?" asked the cardinal. "Whence comes all this disorder?" "From the serpent," replied Rosa Venozza, gnashing her teeth. "From the serpent you have warmed in your bosom. He has bitten me, fearing no doubt that his teeth would be broken on you." "Who has done this?" cried César. "Tell me, and by Heaven, mother, he shall pay, and pay indeed." "Who?" replied Rosa. "King Charles VIII has done it, by the hands of his faithful allies, the Swiss. It was well known that Melchior was away, and that I was living alone with a few wretched servants, so they came and broke in the doors, as though they were taking Rome by storm, and while Cardinal Valentino was making holiday with their master, they pillaged his mother's house, loading her with insults and outrages which no Turks or Saracens could possibly have improved upon." "Very good, mother, very good," said César. "Be calm. Blood shall wash out disgrace. Consider a moment. What we have lost is nothing compared with what we might lose. And my father and I, you may be quite sure, will give you back more than they have stolen from you." "I ask for no promises," cried Rosa. "I ask for revenge." "My mother," said the cardinal, "you shall be avenged, or I will lose the name of son." Having by these words reassured his mother, he took her to Lucrezia's palace, which in consequence of her marriage with Pizarro was unoccupied, and himself returned to the Vatican, giving orders that his mother's house should be refurnished more magnificently than before the disaster. These orders were punctually executed, and it was among her new luxurious surroundings, but with the same hatred in her heart, that Cæsar on this occasion found his mother. This feeling prompted her cry of joy when she saw him once more. The mother and son exchanged a very few words. Then Cæsar, mounting on horseback, went to the Vatican, whence as a hostage he had departed 2 days before. Alexander, who knew of the flight beforehand, and not only approved, but as sovereign pontiff had previously absolved his son of the perjury he was about to commit, received him joyfully, but all the same advised him to lie concealed, as Charles in all probability would not be slow to reclaim his hostage. Indeed, the next day when the king got up, the absence of Cardinal Valentino was observed, and as Charles was uneasy at not seeing him, he sent to inquire what had prevented his appearance. When the messenger arrived at the house that Cæsar had left the evening before, he learnt that he had gone out at 9 o'clock in the evening, and had not returned since. He went back with this news to the king, who at once suspected that he had fled, and in the first flush of his anger let the whole army know of his perjury. The soldiers then remembered the 20 wagons, so heavily laden, from one of which the cardinal, in the sight of all, had produced such magnificent gold and silver plate, and never doubting that the cargo of the others was equally precious, they fetched them down and broke them to pieces. But inside they found nothing but stones and sand, which proved to the king that the flight had been planned a long time back, and incensed him doubly against the Pope. So without loss of time he dispatched to Rome Philippe de Bresse, afterwards Duke of Savoy, with orders to intimate to the Holy Father his displeasure at this conduct. But the Pope replied that he knew nothing whatever about his son's flight, and expressed the sincerest regret to his Majesty, declaring that he knew nothing of his whereabouts, but was certain that he was not in Rome. As a fact, the Pope was speaking the truth this time, for Cæsar had gone with Cardinal Orsini to one of his estates, and was temporarily in hiding there. This reply was conveyed to Charles by 2 messengers from the Pope, the bishops of Naples and Sutri, and the people also sent an ambassador in their own behalf. He was Monsignore Porcari, Dean of the Rota, who was charged to communicate to the king the displeasure of the Romans when they learned of the cardinal's breach of faith. Little as Charles was disposed to content himself with empty words, he had to turn his attention to more serious affairs. So he continued his march to Naples without stopping, arriving there on Sunday, the 22nd of February, 1495. 4 days later the unlucky de Gem, who had fallen sick at Capua, died at Castel Nuovo. When he was leaving at the farewell banquet, Alexander had tried on his guest the poison he intended to use so often later on upon his cardinals, and whose effects he was destined to feel himself. Such is poetical justice. In this way the Pope had secured a double haul, for, in his twofold speculation in this wretched young man, he had sold him alive to Charles for 120,000 livres, and sold him dead to Bajazet for 300,000 ducats. But there was a certain delay about the second payment, for the Turkish emperor, as we remember, was not bound to pay the price of fratricide till he received the corpse, and by Charles's order the corpse had been buried at Gaeta. When Cæsar Borgia learned the news, he rightly supposed that the king would be so busy settling himself in his new capital that he would have too much to think of to be worrying about him. So he went to Rome again, and, anxious to keep his promise to his mother, he signaled his return by a terrible vengeance. Cardinal Valentino had in his service a certain Spaniard, whom he had made the chief of his bravos. He was a man of 35 or 40, whose whole life had been one long rebellion against society's laws. He recoiled from no action, provided only that he could get his price. This Don Michele Correglia, who earned his celebrity for bloody deeds under the name of Michelotto, was just the man Cæsar wanted; and whereas Michelotto felt an unbounded admiration for Cæsar, Cæsar had unlimited confidence in Michelotto. It was to him the cardinal entrusted the execution of one part of his vengeance; the other he kept for himself. Don Michele received orders to scour the Campagna and cut every French throat he could find. He began his work at once, and very few days elapsed before he had obtained most satisfactory results. More than 100 persons were robbed or assassinated, and among the last the son of Cardinal de Saint Malo, who was on his way back to France, and on whom Michelotto found a sum of 3,000 crowns. For himself Cæsar reserved the Swiss, for it was the Swiss in particular who had despoiled his mother's house. The Pope had in his service about 150 soldiers belonging to their nation, who had settled their families in Rome, and had grown rich partly by their pay and partly in the exercise of various industries. The Cardinal had every one of them dismissed, with orders to quit Rome within 24 hours, and the Roman territories within 3 days. The poor wretches had all collected together to obey the order, with their wives and children and baggage, on the Piazza of St. Peter, when suddenly, by Cardinal Valentino's orders, they were hemmed in on all sides by 2,000 Spaniards, who began to fire on them with their guns and charge them with their sabres, while Cæsar and his mother looked down upon the carnage from a window. In this way they killed 50 or perhaps 60, but the rest coming up made a charge at the assassins, and then, without suffering any loss, managed to beat a retreat to a house where they stood a siege, and made so valiant a defence that they gave the Pope time (he knew nothing of the author of this butchery) to send a captain of his guard to the rescue, who, with a strong detachment, succeeded in getting nearly 40 of them safely out of the town. The rest had been massacred on the piazza, or killed in the house. But this was no real and adequate revenge, for it did not touch Charles himself, the sole author of all the troubles that the Pope and his family had experienced during the last year. So Cæsar soon abandoned vulgar schemes of this kind, and busied himself with loftier concerns, bending all the force of his genius to restore the League of Italian princes that had been broken by the defection of Sforza, the exile of Piero dei Medici, and the defeat of Alfonso. The enterprise was more easily accomplished than the Pope could have anticipated. The Venetians were very uneasy when Charles passed so near, and they trembled lest, when he was once master of Naples, he might conceive the idea of conquering the rest of Italy. Ludovico Sforza, on his side, was beginning to tremble, seeing the rapidity with which the King of France had dethroned the House of Aragon, lest he might not make much difference between his allies and his enemies. Maximilian, for his part, was only seeking an occasion to break the temporary peace which he had granted for the sake of the concession made to him. Lastly, Ferdinand and Isabella were allies of the dethroned house. And so it came about that all of them, for different reasons, felt a common fear, and were soon in agreement as to the necessity of driving out Charles VIII., not only from Naples, but from Italy, and pledged themselves to work together to this end by every means in their power, by negotiations, by trickery, or by actual force. The Florentines alone refused to take part in this general levy of arms, and remained faithful to their promises. According to the articles of the treaty agreed upon by the confederates, the alliance was to last for 25 years, and had for ostensible object the upholding of the majority of the Pope and the interests of Christendom. And these preparations might well have been taken for such as would proceed a crusade against the Turks, if Bajazet's ambassadors had not always been present at the deliberations, although the Christian princes could not have dared for very shame to admit the Sultan by name into their league. Now the confederates had to set on foot an army of 30,000 horse and 20,000 infantry, and each of them was taxed for a contingent. Thus the Pope was to furnish 4,000 horse, Maximilian 6,000, the King of Spain, the Duke of Milan, and the Republic of Venice 8,000 each. Every confederate was, in addition to this, to levy and equip 4,000 infantry in the 6 weeks following the signature of the treaty. The fleets were to be equipped by the maritime states, but any expenses they should incur later on were to be defrayed by all in equal shares. The formation of this league was made public on the 12th of April, 1495, Palm Sunday, and in all the Italian states, especially at Rome, was made the occasion of fêtes and immense rejoicings. Almost as soon as the publicly known articles were announced, the secret ones were put into execution. These obliged Ferdinand and Isabella to send a fleet of 60 galleys to Ischia, where Alfonso's son had retired, with 600 horsemen on board and 5,000 infantry, to help him to ascend the throne once more. Those troops were to be put under the command of Gonzalvo of Cordova, who had gained the reputation of the greatest general in Europe after the taking of Granada. The Venetians, with a fleet of 40 galleys under the command of Antonio Grimani, were to attack all the French stations on the coast of Calabria and Naples. The Duke of Milan promised for his part to check all reinforcements as they should arrive from France, and to drive the Duke of Orleans out of Asti. Lastly, there was Maximilian, who had promised to make invasions on the frontiers, and Bajazet, who was to help with money, ships, and soldiers, either the Venetians or the Spaniards, according as he might be appealed to by Barbarigo or by Ferdinand the Catholic. This league was all the more disconcerting for Charles because of the speedy abatement of the enthusiasm that had hailed his first appearance. What had happened to him was what generally happens to a conqueror who has more good luck than talent. Instead of making himself a party among the great Neapolitan and Calabrian vassals, whose roots would be embedded in the very soil, by confirming their privileges and augmenting their power, he had wounded their feelings by bestowing all the titles, offices, and fiefs on those alone who had followed him from France, so that all the important positions in the kingdom were filled by strangers. The result was that just when the league was made known, Tropea and Amantea, which had been presented by Charles to the Seigneur de Pressy, rose in revolt and hoisted the banner of Aragon, and the Spanish fleet had only to present itself at Reggio in Calabria for the town to throw open its gates, being more discontented with the new rule than the old. And Don Federigo, Alfonso's brother and Ferdinand's uncle, who had hitherto never quitted Brindisi, had only to appear at Tarentum to be received there as a liberator. End of section 11.
Section 12 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 12. The Borgias. Chapter 6, Part 1. Charles learned all this news at Naples, and, tired of his late conquests, which necessitated a labour in organisation for which he was quite unfitted, turned his eyes towards France, where victorious fates and rejoicings were awaiting the victor's return. So he yielded at the first breath of his advisers, and retraced his road to his kingdom, threatened, as was said, by the Germans on the north and the Spaniards on the south. Consequently he appointed Gilbert de Montpensier, of the House of Bourbon, viceroy, d'Aubigny, of the Scotch Stuart family, lieutenant in Calabria, Etienne de Vez, commander at Gaeta, and Don Giuliano, Gabriel de Montfaucon, Guillaume de Villeneuve, Georges de Lilly, the bailiff of Vitry, and Graziano Guerra, respectively, governors of Sant' Angelo, Manfredonia, Trani, Catanzaro, Aquila, and Solmon, then leaving behind in evidence of his claims the half of his Swiss, a party of his Gascons, 800 French lances, and about 500 Italian men-at-arms, the last under the command of the prefect of Rome, Prospero and Fabrizio Colonna, and Antonio Savelli. He left Naples on the 20th of May at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, to traverse the whole of the Italian peninsula with the rest of his army, consisting of 800 French lances, 200 gentlemen of his guard, 100 Italian men-at-arms, 3,000 Swiss infantry, 1,000 French, and 1,000 Gascons. He also expected to be joined by Camillo Vitelli and his brothers in Tuscany, who were to contribute 250 men-at-arms. A week before he left Naples, Charles had sent to Rome Monseigneur de St. Paul, brother of Cardinal de Luxembourg, and just as he was starting he dispatched thither the new Archbishop of Lyons. They both were commissioned to assure Alexander that the King of France had the most sincere desire and the very best intention of remaining his friend. In truth, Charles wished for nothing so much as to separate the Pope from the League, so as to secure him as a spiritual and temporal support. But a young king, full of fire, ambition, and courage, was not the neighbour to suit Alexander, so the latter would listen to nothing, and as the troops he had demanded from the Doge and Ludovico Sforza had not been sent in sufficient number for the defence of Rome, he was content with provisioning the castle of St. Angelo, putting in a formidable garrison, and leaving Cardinal Sant' Anastasio to receive Charles while he himself withdrew with Caesar to Orvieto. Charles only stayed in Rome 3 days, utterly depressed because the Pope had refused to receive him in spite of his entreaties; and in these 3 days, instead of listening to Giuliano delta Rovere, who was advising him once more to call a council and depose the Pope, he rather hoped to bring the Pope round to his side by the virtuous act of restoring the citadels of Terracina and Civita Vecchia to the authorities of the Romagna, only keeping for himself Ostia, which he had promised Giuliano to give back to him. At last, when the 3 days had elapsed, he left Rome and resumed his march in 3 columns towards Tuscany, crossed the States of the Church, and on the 13th reached Siena, where he was joined by Philippe de Comines, who had gone as ambassador extraordinary to the Venetian Republic, and now announced that the enemy had 40,000 men under arms and were preparing for battle. This news produced no other effect on the king and the gentlemen of his army than to excite their amusement beyond measure, for their enemy by their easy conquest, that they could not believe that any army, however numerous, would venture to oppose their passage. Charles, however, was forced to give way in the face of facts, when he heard at San Terranza that his vanguard, commanded by Maréchal de Guy, and composed of 600 lancers and 1,500 Swiss, when it arrived at Fornova had come face to face with the confederates, who had encamped at Girole. The Maréchal had ordered an instant halt, and he too had pitched his tents, utilizing for his defence the natural advantages of the hilly ground. When these first measures had been taken, he sent out, first, a herald to the enemy's camp to ask from Francesco di Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, generalissimo of the confederate troops, a passage for his king's army, and provisions at a reasonable price; and secondly, he dispatched a courier to Charles VIII, pressing him to hurry on his march with the artillery and rearguard. The confederates had given an evasive answer, for they were pondering whether they ought to jeopardize the whole Italian force in a single combat, and putting all to the hazard, attempt to annihilate the King of France and his army together, so overwhelming the conqueror in the ruins of his ambition. The messenger found Charles busy superintending the passage of the last of his cannon over the mountains of Pontremoli. This was no easy matter, seeing that there was no sort of track, and the guns had to be lifted up and lowered by main force, and each piece needed the arms of as many as 200 men. At last, when all the artillery had arrived without accident on the other side of the Apennines, Charles started in hot haste for Fornovo, where he arrived with all his following on the morning of the next day. From the top of the mountain where the Maréchal de Guy had pitched his tents, the king beheld both his own camp and the enemy's. Both were on the right bank of the Taro, and were at either end of a semicircular chain of hills resembling an amphitheatre, and the space between the 2 camps, a vast basin during the winter floods by the torrent which now only marked its boundary, was nothing but a plain covered with gravel, where all manoeuvres must be equally difficult for horse and infantry. Besides, on the western slope of the hills there was a little wood which extended from the enemy's army to the French, and was in the possession of the Stradiotes, who, by help of its cover, had already engaged in several skirmishes with the French troops during the 2 days of halt while they were waiting for the king. The situation was not reassuring. From the top of the mountain which overlooked Fornovo, one could get a view, as we said before, of the 2 camps, and could easily calculate the numerical difference between them. The French army, weakened by the establishment of garrisons in the various towns and fortresses they had won in Italy, were scarcely 8,000 strong, while the combined forces of Milan and Venice exceeded a total of 35,000. So Charles decided to try once more the methods of conciliation, and sent Comines, who, as we know, had joined him in Tuscany, to the Venetian Provveditori, whose acquaintance he had made when on his embassy, he having made a great impression on these men, thanks to a general high opinion of his merits. he was commissioned to tell the enemy's generals, in the name of the King of France, that his master only desired to continue his road without doing or receiving any harm, and therefore he asked to be allowed a free passage across the fair plains of Lombardy, which he could see from the heights where he now stood, stretching as far as the eye could reach, away to the foot of the Alps. Comines found the Confederate army deep in discussion, the wish of the Milanese and Venetian party being to let the king go by, and not attack him. They said they were only too happy that he should leave Italy in this way, without causing further harm; but the ambassadors of Spain and Germany took quite another view. As their masters had no troops in the army, and as all the money they had promised was already paid, they must be the gainer in either case from a battle, whichever way it went; for if they won the day they would gather the fruits of victory, and if they lost they would experience nothing of the evils of defeat. This want of unanimity was the reason why the answer to Comines was deferred until the following day, and why it was settled that on the next day he should hold another conference with the plenipotentiary to be appointed in the course of that night. The place of this conference was to be between the two armies. The king passed the night in great uneasiness. All day the weather had threatened to turn to rain, and we have already said how rapidly the Taro could swell. The river, fordable to day, might from tomorrow onwards prove an insurmountable obstacle, and possibly the delay had only been asked for with a view to putting the French army in a worse position. As a fact, the night had scarcely come when a terrible storm arose, and so long as darkness lasted, great rumblings were heard in the Apennines, and the sky was brilliant with lightning. At break of day, however, it seemed to be getting a little calmer, though the Taro, only a streamlet the day before, had become a torrent by this time, and was rapidly rising. So at 6 in the morning, the king, ready and armed on horseback, summoned Comines and bade him make his way to the rendezvous that the Venetian Proveditore had assigned. But scarcely had he contrived to give the order when loud cries were heard coming from the extreme right of the French army. The Stradiotes, under cover of the wood stretching between the two camps, had surprised an outpost, and first cutting the soldiers' throats, were carrying off their heads in their usual way at the saddle-bow. A detachment of cavalry was sent in pursuit, but, like wild animals, they had retreated to their lair in the woods, and there disappeared. This unexpected engagement, in all probability arranged beforehand by the Spanish and German envoys, produced on the whole army the effect of a spark applied to a train of gunpowder. Comines and the Venetian Proveditore each tried in vain to arrest the combat on either side. Light troops, eager for a skirmish, and, in the usual fashion of those days, prompted only by that personal courage which led them on to danger, had already come to blows, rushing down into the plain as though it were an amphitheatre where they might make a fine display of arms. For a moment the young king, drawn on by example, was on the point of forgetting the responsibility of a general in his zeal as a soldier; but this first impulse was checked by Marechal de Guise, Messire Claude de la Châtre de Guise, and Monsieur de la Tremaille, who persuaded Charles to adopt the wiser plan, and to cross the Taro without seeking a battle, at the same time without trying to avoid it, should the enemy cross the river from their camp and attempt to block his passage. The king accordingly, following the advice of his wisest and bravest captains, thus arranged his divisions. The first comprised the van and a body of troops whose duty it was to support them. The van consisted of 350 men-at-arms, the best and bravest of the army, under the command of Marechal de Guise and Jacques Trevulles. The corps following them consisted of 3,000 Swiss, under the command of Engelbert de Clèves and de Launay, the queen's grand equerry. Next came 300 archers of the guard, whom the king had sent to help the cavalry by fighting in the spaces between them. The second division, commanded by the king in person and forming the middle of the army, was composed of the artillery, under Jean de la Grange, 100 gentlemen of the guard, with Gilles Caron for standard-bearer, pensioners of the king's household under Aymar de Prie, some Scots, and 200 crossbowmen on horseback, with French archers besides, led by M. de Crusault. Lastly, the third division, i.e. the rear, preceded by 6,000 beasts of burden bearing the baggage, was composed of only 300 men-at-arms, commanded by de Guise and by de la Tremouille. This was the weakest part of the army. When this arrangement was settled, Charles ordered the van to cross the river, just at the little town of Fourneveau. This was done at once, the riders getting wet up to their knees, and the footmen holding to the horses' tails. As soon as he saw the last soldiers of his first division on the opposite bank, he started himself to follow the same road and cross at the same ford, giving orders to de Guise and de la Tremouille to regulate the march of the rear guard by that of the centre, just as he had regulated their march by that of the van. His orders were punctually carried out, and about 10 o'clock in the morning the whole French army was on the left bank of the Taro. At the same time, when it seemed certain from the enemy's arrangement that battle was imminent, the baggage, led by the captain, Odet de Reberac, was separated from the rear guard, and retired to the extreme left. Now, Francisco de Gonzaga, general in chief of the Confederate troops, had modelled his plans on those of the King of France. By his orders, Count de Cajazzo, with 400 men at arms and 2,000 infantry, had crossed the Taro where the Venetian camp lay, and was to attack the French van, while Gonzaga himself, following the right bank as far as Fornovo, would go over the river by the same ford that Charles had used, with a view to attacking his rear. Lastly, he had placed the Stradiotes between these two fords, with orders to cross the river in their turn, so soon as they saw the French army, attacked both in van and in the rear, and to fall upon its flank. Not content with offensive measures, Gonzaga had also made provision for retreat by leaving 3 reserve corps on the right bank, one to guard the camp under the instruction of the Venetian provveditori, and the other 2 arranged in echelon to support each other, the first commanded by Antonio de Montefeltro, the second by Annibale Bentivoglio. Charles had observed all these arrangements, and had recognized the cunning Italian strategy which made his opponents the finest generals in the world; but as there was no means of avoiding the danger, he had decided to take a sideway course, and had given orders to continue the march. But in a minute the French army was caught between Count de Cajazzo, barring the way with his 400 men at arms and his 2,000 infantry, and Gonzaga in pursuit of the rear, as we said before, leading 600 men at arms, the flower of his army, a squadron of Stradiotes, and more than 5,000 infantry. This division alone was stronger than the whole of the French army. Section 12.